Greetings, road warriors. Tonight, our chronicle covers the birth and evolution of an absolute legend in the world of heavy haulage, a piece of machinery that transformed the soundscape of European highways and became a symbol of raw, unadulterated power. We're talking about the king of the road, the Scania V8. Imagine, if you will, the crisp air of a Swedish morning, the kind where the frost clings to the pine needles and the breath of the forest seems to hang suspended in the stillness. Then silence is broken not by a harsh clanking but by a deep rhythmic thrum, a heartbeat of iron and oil that signals the start of a long haul. It is a sound that comforts drivers from Södertälje to Sicily. Let's be honest, finding a shower with actual water pressure at a truck stop is about as rare as a four-wheeler using their turn signal correctly, but we keep rolling anyway because the road calls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and let me know in the comments where you're parked tonight, or which mile marker you're passing, and what the local time is. It's always good to know we aren't the only ones watching the white lines tick by. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand the magnitude of the Scania V8, we have to look in the rearview mirror, all the way back to the late 1960s. It was a different world then. The dust of the post-war reconstruction in Europe had settled, and the continent was shifting gears from rebuilding to booming. Economies were growing, factories were churning out goods at unprecedented rates, and the appetite for consumer products was skyrocketing. People wanted timber from the north, steel from the Ruhr Valley, and produce from the Mediterranean, and they wanted it yesterday. However, there was a significant mechanical bottleneck in this logistics revolution: the trucks themselves. In the mid-60s, the average heavy-duty truck was, to put it politely, wheezing. We look back at classic trucks now with rose-tinted glasses, admiring their vintage lines and simple mechanics, but driving them was a physical workout that bordered on wrestling. Most long-haul trucks of this era were pushing out somewhere between 200 and 250 horsepower. Today you might find that kind of power in a sporty family sedan, but back then it was tasked with pulling 30 or 40 tons of dead weight up the Alps. The result was a transportation network that moved at the pace of a tired snail. The geography of Europe played a massive role in this power struggle. Unlike the vast, flat interstates of the American Midwest where a truck can settle into a high gear and cruise for hours, Europe is a patchwork of rolling hills, sharp inclines, and twisting regional roads. The topography was unforgiving to underpowered engines. There is a specific misery known only to old-school truckers who drove in that era: the crawl. You would hit a grade, perhaps something like the Brenner Pass connecting Italy and Austria, and watch your speedometer drop like a stone. You would split gears, downshifting frantically, praying you didn't miss a gate until you were in first or second gear, engine screaming, crawling up the incline at walking speed. It wasn't just annoying, it was inefficient. It created massive traffic jams. The elephant race, where one truck doing 40 kilometers per hour tries to overtake another doing 39. Became a defining feature of the Autobahn, much to the frustration of the growing number of car drivers zipping around in their nimble Beetles and Fiats. This brings us to a crucial historical pivot point. It wasn't just market demand pushing for more power, it was the heavy hand of the law. In the late 60s, the West German government, dealing with clogged arteries on their famous road network, proposed a piece of legislation that sent shivers down the spines of truck manufacturers. They floated the idea of a minimum power-to-weight ratio. The proposed regulation suggested that for every ton of gross combination weight, the truck needed a specific amount of horsepower to ensure it could keep up with traffic. The magic number being discussed was initially 6 horsepower per ton, with plans to ramp it up to 8 horsepower per ton. Let's do the math on that. If you were hauling a standard maximum load of roughly 40 tons, and the law demanded 8 horsepower per ton, you suddenly needed an engine capable of producing 320 horsepower. At the time, that was unheard of for a standard production truck. It was supercar territory. Most manufacturers, including Scania V8, as it was known then, were relying on inline-6 engines that were tapped out. They were reliable, sturdy workhorses, but squeezing another 70 or 80 horses out of them without compromising their lifespan was an engineering nightmare. Scania knew they had to do something radical. They were a company with a reputation for quality, deeply rooted in the harsh climate of Sweden, where equipment failure could be life-threatening, not just expensive. They couldn't just bolt on a massive turbocharger to a small engine and hope it held together for 1,000,000 kilometers. They needed displacement. They needed volume. But here was the second problem, the truck cab itself. In the United States, the conventional truck, the long-nosed design with the engine out in front of the driver, was king. You could put a massive engine under that long hood because length restrictions were more generous, or at least calculated differently. But in Europe, the trend was shifting aggressively toward the cab-over-engine or COE design. To maximise the amount of cargo a truck could legally carry within the strict total length limits of European laws, the cab had to be squashed forward, sitting directly on top of the front axle and the engine. This created a strict box of space, a doghouse between the driver and passenger seats, where the engine had to live. If Scania wanted more power, the logical step would be an inline 8-cylinder engine. But an inline 8 is long. It's like carrying a telephone pole under the floorboards. It simply wouldn't fit under a standard tilting cab without extending the back of the cab and eating into precious cargo space. The engineers were boxed in, quite literally. The atmosphere at Södertälje, Scania's headquarters, was one of intense pressure. They weren't the only ones reading the tea leaves. Volvo, their neighbour and eternal rival, was also cooking up high-power solutions. Mercedes-Benz was experimenting with V10 and V12 engines that were naturally aspirated, meaning no turbo, which made them massive, heavy lumps of iron. Scania needed a solution that was compact, powerful, and above all, efficient. This era of trucking was also distinct for its lack of creature comforts, which amplified the need for a better engine. We aren't talking about air-suspended seats and climate control. A driver named Lars, a veteran of the Swedish timber runs who started driving in 1967, once described his office as a tin can on a vibrator. He recalled that in winter, the heat from the engine tunnel was the only thing keeping his left leg warm while his right leg froze near the door. But more than the cold, he remembered the noise. In an underpowered truck, the engine is always working at maximum capacity. It's always shouting. A bigger, more powerful engine wouldn't just mean speed. It would mean a relaxed engine. It would mean climbing a hill at a 500 RPM instead of 200. It would mean quiet. For the drivers, this power gap was personal. It was about dignity. There is a certain pride in handling a machine that feels capable, a machine that dominates the road rather than struggling against it. Being the driver who held up a 5-mile line of cars on a gradient was stressful. You could feel the anger radiating from the rearview mirror. The industry was desperate for a hero, a machine that could flatten the hills and shrink the distances. Scania's management looked at the projections. The highways of Europe were expanding. The Iron Curtain, while politically rigid, was porous to trade. Trucks were going further, from Scandinavia to the Middle East, a route that would become legendary in the decades to follow. These Orient Express runs required a vehicle that could handle the freezing north, the high Alps, and the scorching deserts of the Middle East, all while hauling heavy machinery or refrigerated goods. The existing 11-litre inline-6 engines were valiant, but they were at their limit. To push them further would mean increasing cylinder pressure to dangerous levels, risking blown gaskets and cracked heads. The only replacement for displacement, as the old adage goes, is more displacement. So, the mandate came down from the top brass. Build an engine that hits the magical 350 horsepower mark. Make it fit under a cab-over. Make it reliable enough to run for 1,000,000 kilometers, and get it done before the competition eats our lunch. It was a tall order. It required rethinking the fundamental architecture of the truck engine. It required moving away from the safety of the inline-6, a layout perfectly balanced by nature, and venturing into the V configuration, which brought its own sets of vibration and packaging challenges. The technical constraints were severe. The frame rails of a truck are a standard width. The engine has to sit between them. A V engine is wider than an inline engine. If the V angle is too wide, it hits the frame rails. If it's too narrow, it becomes top-heavy and hard to service. And then there were the ancillaries. The alternator, the water pump, the fuel injection pump. Everything had to be squeezed into a cube of space that was already fiercely contested. But the 1960s were an era of engineering optimism. We were going to the moon. We were building supersonic airliners. Surely a team of Swedish engineers could figure out how to pack 350 horses into a box the size of a refined dining table. The stage was set. The market was screaming for power. The legislation was demanding performance. The drivers were praying for relief from the endless gear shifting. The competition was closing in. Scania stood on the precipice of a decision that would not only save their market share but would define their brand identity for the next half-century. They needed a mastermind to put it all together. They needed someone who understood not just thermodynamics, but the art of packaging. They needed a blueprint that would become sacred text in the world of diesel mechanics. The waiting was over. It was time to build the beast. The man who stepped into this high-pressure vacuum was named Bengt Gadefelt. In the pantheon of automotive engineering, names like Ferrari or Porsche often steal the limelight, celebrated for their racing pedigrees and sleek silhouettes. But in the gritty, diesel-soaked world of heavy transport, Gadefelt occupies a throne of his own. He was Scania's head of engine design, a man who viewed a cylinder block not just as a chunk of iron, but as a sculptural problem of space, heat, and stress. Gadefelt was a pragmatist. He looked at the available options for reaching that elusive 350 horsepower target and immediately discarded the idea of simply stretching the existing inline six. You can only bore out a cylinder so much before the walls get too thin to contain the explosion. He also dismissed the inline 8, knowing that while it would provide the power, it would turn the truck into a limousine-length nightmare that couldn't navigate a roundabout in a quaint French village. The solution had to be a V configuration. By splitting the cylinders into two banks of 4, arranged in a V shape, you effectively cut the length of the engine in half. It becomes a cube rather than a beam, but the devil, as always, is in the geometry. The design team at Södertälje gathered around drafting tables. This was long before computer-aided design or CAD took over. Imagine a room thick with the smell of graphite, stale coffee and the hazy blue smoke of cigarettes, lit by the warm glow of angle poise lamps. Here, with slide rules and calipers, they debated the angle of the V. A 60-degree V8 is compact and narrow, fitting easily between the frame rails, but it's taller. A 90-degree V8 is wider, but significantly lower. Gadefelt and his team bet the farm on the 90-degree layout. This was a critical decision. By choosing the wider 90-degree angle, they kept the engine profile low. This was essential for the doghouse, that engine tunnel inside the cab. A tall engine would force the driver's seat up towards the roof, or create a massive hump in the middle of the cabin that made moving around impossible. The 90-degree V8 sat low and squat, a dense brick of power that respected the driver's living space. This decision, however, birthed a challenge regarding the frame rails. A truck's chassis is essentially two long steel beams running front to back. The engine has to sit snugly between them. A 90-degree V8 is wide at the shoulders. To make it fit, the engineers had to be incredibly clever with the placement of the ancillaries. The alternator, the air compressor, and the injection pump had to be tucked into the valley of the V or mounted tightly against the sides, like a hiker packing a rucksack for a steep climb where every inch of space matters. One specific technical detail that set this blueprint apart was the cylinder heads. Most V8 engines of the time, particularly the American gas guzzlers, used a single cylinder head for each bank, one long slab of metal covering 4 cylinders. Gadefelt's team went a different route, individual cylinder heads. Each cylinder had its own separate cap. This might sound like a minor detail to a layman, but to a mechanic working in a freezing roadside workshop in Norway it was a revelation. If a single cylinder had an issue, say, a burnt valve, you didn't have to lift a massive heavy head off the entire bank, breaking the seal on 3 perfectly good cylinders. You just popped off the one you needed to fix. It was the beginning of Scania's philosophy of modularity, a concept that would later define their entire production system. It showed that the designers weren't just thinking about horsepower numbers on a dyno sheet. They were thinking about the knuckles of the people who would maintain these beasts. Then came the question of aspiration. To get 14.2 litres of displacement, the final size decided upon, to produce 350 horsepower efficiently, natural aspiration wasn't enough. They needed to force-feed the engine air. They needed turbocharging. Turbocharging wasn't new, but in the late 60s it was still treated with suspicion by many in the industry. It added complexity, it added heat. A turbocharger is essentially a turbine spun by hot exhaust gases, which spins a compressor wheel that shoves more air into the engine. It spins at incredible speeds, tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. If you don't get the oiling and the metallurgy right, a turbo turns into a hand grenade very quickly. Scania had been experimenting with turbos since the 1950s, largely due to their marine engine division. Boats, unlike trucks, run at constant high loads, which is the perfect testing ground for forced induction. Gadefelt pulled that marine expertise onto the asphalt. He designed the V8 to be turbocharged from day one. It wasn't an aftermarket thought. The engine block was reinforced with extra ribbing to handle the immense pressures that the turbo would create. They built it to be over-dimensioned, a lovely Swedish engineering term meaning they built it stronger than it theoretically needed to be just in case. There is a wonderful anecdote from the prototyping phase that captures the spirit of this project. The engineers were testing the first prototype of the DS14, the code name for the new engine. D for diesel, S for supercharged, turbo, and 14 for the displacement. They had it on a test bench, running it at full load for hours to simulate a climb up the Alps. The exhaust manifolds were glowing cherry red, radiating heat that you could feel from across the room. One of the junior engineers, a young man named Mats who had just joined the company, was nervously watching the temperature gauges, convinced the thing was about to melt into a puddle of slag. Gadefelt walked by, paused, listened to the deep rhythmic hammering of the pistons and supposedly said, "It sounds angry. Good. It should be angry." He didn't look at the gauges. He listened to the metal. He knew the engine was happy because the rhythm was consistent. It was the sound of controlled explosions, perfectly timed. The blueprint they finalized was a masterpiece of packaging. The crankshaft was a robust forged steel unit with 5 main bearings, ensuring it wouldn't flex under the torque. The camshaft was nestled deep in the V, operating the valves via pushrods, a traditional sturdy method that kept the overall height down. But the real magic was in the dimensions. The engine was remarkably short for its capacity. By keeping it short, Scania preserved the ability to have a spacious cab. This is the constant tug-of-war in truck design. The driver wants a palace, the law wants a short truck, and the mechanics want a simple engine. Gadefelt managed to satisfy all three. The development wasn't without its hiccups. The 90-degree V8 has a natural vibration due to the firing order and the movement of the pistons. An inline-six is naturally balanced, a V8 is not. To counter this, the team had to be meticulous with the counterweights on the crankshaft. They spent weeks balancing the rotating assembly, shaving grams of metal off here and adding weight there, until the engine could spin up without shaking the fillings out of the driver's teeth. It's worth noting that this design phase took place during a time of great cultural shift. While the engineers were calculating valve overlap, the world outside was listening to the Beatles and watching the moon landing. There was a sense that technology could solve anything. The Scania V8 was a product of this optimism. It was a rejection of the idea that trucks had to be slow and cumbersome. It was a statement that a commercial vehicle could be a high-performance machine. The blueprint also included a very specific exhaust manifold design. Because the turbocharger needed to be driven by pulses of exhaust gas, the manifold had to collect these gases efficiently. On the 90-degree V8, the firing order created a specific pulse sequence. The engineers tuned the length of the exhaust pipes to ensure the pulses hit the turbo turbine at exactly the right moments to keep it spinning fast. This tuning, almost like tuning a pipe organ, accidentally created a byproduct that wasn't on the spec sheet, but would become the engine's most famous attribute, the sound. They weren't trying to make music, they were trying to reduce turbo lag. But by separating the exhaust pulses to optimize flow, they created that distinctive low-frequency burble, a sound distinct from the high-pitched whine of American two-stroke diesels or the flat drone of an inline-six. It was a deep, guttural wub-wub-wub at idle that turned into a roar under load. By 1968, the blueprints were finalized. The prototype engines had survived thousands of hours on the test benches. They had been installed in mule trucks, unmarked vehicles sent out to run real routes with trusted customers who were sworn to secrecy. These test drivers reported back with glowing eyes. They were climbing hills in 2 gears higher than usual. They were arriving at destinations an hour early. They were passing cars. The boxy cast-iron heart of the future Scania legend was ready. It was compact, it was modular, it was turbocharged, and it was incredibly strong. Bengt Gadefelt and his team had done the impossible. They had fit a giant into a shoebox. All that remained was to introduce it to the world and see if the market was ready to embrace a truck that cost more than the competition, but promised to change the economics of transport forever. The drawings were rolled up. The slide rules were put away. The foundry was heating up. The LB140 was about to be born. The year 1969 is etched into the collective memory of humanity largely because of a singular celestial event. 3 men strapped into a tin can blasting off toward the moon. But while the world's eyes were turned upward toward the stars, the eyes of the European transport industry were fixed firmly on a trade show floor in Frankfurt, Germany. It was late autumn, the air was crisp, and the International Motor Show, the A, was buzzing with a different kind of anticipation. At the Scania V8 stand, under the bright industrial lights, sat a machine that would do for heavy haulage what the Apollo program did for space travel, change the perception of what was possible. The cover was pulled back to reveal the Scania LB140. To the uninitiated, it looked like just another truck. It was boxy, upright, and painted in the muted industrial colours typical of the era. But to the hauliers, fleet managers and journalists gathered around, the badge on the grille screamed defiance. It read V8 on one side and 350 on the other. A collective gasp, followed by a low murmur of disbelief, rippled through the crowd. You have to understand the context to appreciate the shock. At that time, the gold standard for a heavy-duty long hauler was the Volvo F88, a fantastic truck that was pushing out roughly 260 to 290 horsepower, depending on the tune. Mercedes-Benz and MAN were playing in similar sandboxes. For Scania to suddenly drop a 350 horsepower hammer on the table wasn't just a step forward, it was a leap across a canyon. It was a declaration of dominance. The model name itself, LB140, was a code for this new reality. L stood for lastbil, the Swedish word for truck. B stood for bulldog, the internal term for a cab-over-engine design where the driver sits right on top of the front axle, much like the snub nose of a bulldog. The 14 denoted the massive 14-litre displacement, and the 0 indicated the series. But nobody really called it the lastbil bulldog, they just called it the 140, often spoken with a tone of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The headline figure was 350 horsepower, but the secret weapon, the thing that would actually move the mountains, was the torque. The new DS14 engine produced 1,245 Newton-meters of torque at just above 100 revolutions per minute. In 1969, that was earth-shattering. It meant that a driver didn't have to wring the engine's neck to get it moving. They could lug it. They could drop a gear and let the engine grunt its way up a hill where other trucks would be screaming at the red line in first gear. Let's look at a specific technical detail that made the LB140 a marvel of usability, not just power, the tilting cab. Before this generation of trucks working on a cab-over engine was a mechanic's version of yoga hell. To access the engine, you usually had to crawl inside the cab, remove the seats, unbolt the engine cover, the doghouse, and work in a cramped, dark, greasy cave while kneeling. On the floorboards, it was miserable. The LB140, however, featured a hydraulic tilting mechanism. With a few pumps of a lever, the entire cab, seats, steering wheel, dashboard, and the driver's coffee cup would hinge forward, exposing the mighty V8 engine in all its glory. It sat there, nestled between the frame rails, fully accessible. Mechanics could stand upright and work on the injectors or the turbocharger. This feature alone endeared the truck to service centres across Europe. It turned a 10-hour repair job into a 4-hour one, keeping the wheels turning and the money flowing. There is a story often told about a Dutch flower hauler named Peter who attended that 1969 show. The flower trade is a race against time. Tulips cut in the morning in the Netherlands need to be in markets in Paris or Milan by the next morning. Peter was running a fleet of underpowered trucks that were constantly late due to the steep climbs in the Ardennes and the Alps. He stood before the LB140, arms crossed, sceptical of the price tag, which was significantly higher than the competition. He asked the Scania representative, "It burns more fuel, yes?" The rep, honest to a fault, nodded. "It consumes more per hour, certainly. It's a 14-litre V8. Peter scoffed, ready to walk away. But the rep grabbed his arm gently and said, "It burns more per hour, Peter, but it burns less per hill, and you will be home for dinner on Friday instead of Saturday morning." Peter bought 2. Within 6 months, he replaced his entire fleet. The math of speed had conquered the math of fuel consumption. The arrival of the LB140 also marked a shift in the psychology of the road. Until this point, trucking was viewed purely as a blue-collar grind. It was slow, dirty, and loud. The V8 changed the status of the driver. If you were behind the wheel of a 140, you were the captain of the highway. You weren't being pushed around by the road, you were dictating terms to it. Competitors were scrambling. Volvo, Scania's arch-rival from Gothenburg, was caught on the back foot. Their F88 was a brilliant truck, reliable, sturdy, and safe, but it simply couldn't catch the V8 on a grade. There is a famous trucking saying from this era: "Uphill, the Scania is the king. Downhill, the Volvo is the queen." It implied that while Volvos had great brakes and handling, the Scania was the only one with the muscle to conquer gravity. The V8 also introduced a new aesthetic to the truck stops. The badge itself became a piece of jewellery. Drivers would polish the chrome V8 emblem until they could see their reflection in it. It became a membership card to an exclusive club. Other drivers would hear the distinctive rumble pulling into a parking lot at night. That low, rhythmic throb that sounded more like a heavy tugboat than a delivery vehicle, and they would know a 140 had arrived. However, harnessing 350 horsepower presented a new engineering hurdle: the transmission. You can't just hook a monster engine up to a bicycle chain. The torque of the V8 would have shredded the standard gearboxes of the time into metal confetti. Scania had to develop a transmission capable of handling the twist. They introduced the GR860 gearbox to pair with the V8. It was a range-change gearbox, meaning you had a main set of gears and a secondary range, high and low. This gave the driver 10 forward speeds. The shift pattern required a certain finesse, a rhythmic dance of the clutch and the gear stick. But when mastered, it allowed the driver to keep the V8 perfectly in its power band. You could keep the needle right in the green zone on the tachometer, riding that wave of torque all the way to Rome. Crucially, the 1969 launch happened right as the TIR system, Transports International Routier, was expanding. This system allowed sealed trucks to cross international borders without custom checks at every single post, provided they had the right blue plate on the back. This opened up the long-haul routes from Northern Europe to the Middle East, the Orient Run. These were brutal 10,000-kilometre round trips through snow, mud and sand. The LB140 was the perfect tool for this new frontier. A smaller engine would die in the heat of the Turkish mountains or freeze in the passes of Yugoslavia. The big V8, over-engineered and under-stressed, just kept chugging. It was during these grueling runs that the legend of Scania's reliability was forged in iron. It wasn't just a show pony, it was a pack mule on steroids. Of course, the truck wasn't perfect. The ride was still stiff by modern standards. Steel leaf springs all around meant you felt every pothole. And while the engine was quieter than its screaming predecessors, the cab insulation in 1969 wasn't exactly soundproof. But to the drivers of the day, the deep baritone of the V8 wasn't noise, it was company. It was a reassuring voice telling them that the machine was working, that the load was moving, and that they were making good time. As the first LB140s rolled off the assembly line in Södertälje and hit the roads, a strange phenomenon occurred. Car drivers, usually annoyed by trucks, started to slow down to look. The truck had presence. It was the king of the road before the marketing team even dreamt up the slogan. It commanded respect not through flashy paint jobs, though many would come later, but through sheer capability. The launch of the LB140 wasn't just a product release. It was the firing of a starting gun for the horsepower wars that would rage for the next 5 decades. Scania had thrown the gauntlet down. They had proved that a cab-over truck could house a massive engine, that a commercial vehicle could have the heart of a performance machine, and that there was a market willing to pay a premium for power. But as the 1970s dawned, the initial euphoria of the launch began to settle into the reality of daily operations. The drivers had their power, yes, but now they had to live with it. They had to learn how to tame the beast on icy roads where too much torque could spin the wheels in an instant. They had to learn the quirks of the new gearbox, and Scania had to learn that being the pioneer means you're also the first to discover the problems. The honeymoon phase was loud and exciting, filled with the smell of diesel and the sound of applause. But the marriage between man and machine is forged in the long, quiet miles that follow. The V8 had arrived, but its journey to perfection was only just beginning. As the 1970s began to unfold, the initial shock and awe of the V8 launch settled into the practical reality of daily life on the road. The brochures were glossy and the showroom lights were flattering, but the true test of the Scania LB140 wasn't under the spotlights of Frankfurt. It was on the slush-covered tarmac of the E4 highway in Sweden and the narrow, twisting lanes of the British Midlands. The transition to the Bulldog, or cab-over engine design, was not merely a cosmetic change. It was a fundamental shift in the geometry of driving. For decades, veteran truckers had operated conventional trucks, vehicles with a long nose stretching out in front of the windshield, housing the engine. In a conventional truck, you sat behind the front axle. You had 1.5 meters of iron hood in front of you, a psychological security blanket that made you feel protected. You aimed the nose like the sight of a rifle. Stepping into the LB140 was a disorienting experience for these old hands. In the cab-over layout, the driver sits directly on top of the front wheels, perched high above the road with nothing in front of their feet but a thin sheet of metal and a glass windshield. It felt, as one British driver vividly described it, like driving a conservatory off the side of a cliff. This new position required a complete rewiring of the driver's spatial awareness. In a long-nosed truck, you start turning the steering wheel as the nose passes the corner. In a cab-over LB140, if you did that, your rear trailer tyres would mount the curb and take out a lamppost or an unsuspecting hedge. You had to drive deep into the intersection, feeling like you had already missed the turn, and then crank the wheel hard at the last second. It was a leap of faith that had to be repeated at every roundabout and junction. But the trade-off for this terrifying vantage point was visibility. Suddenly, the driver could see right down to the bumper. In the tight medieval streets of European cities where delivery docks were often repurposed courtyards designed for horse carts, this manoeuvrability was a godsend. You could thread the needle with a 140 in ways that were physically impossible with the older, long-snout torpedo models. Yet, the most significant adjustment wasn't the steering, it was the soundtrack. This is where the cultural phenomenon of the Scania V8 truly began to take root. Before the V8, a diesel engine was simply a noisemaker. It clattered, it banged, and it whined. It was an industrial racket that you tolerated because it paid the bills. The Scania DS14 engine, however, produced a sound that was musical. Because of the 90-degree angle of the cylinder banks and the specific firing order, the exhaust pulses exited the manifold in a syncopated rhythm. It wasn't a continuous drone, it was a heartbeat. Dub, 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 dub. Drivers began to notice something strange. On long night hauls, the low-frequency resonance of the V8 was less fatiguing than the high-pitched screaming of smaller engines. It was a bass note that vibrated through the floorboards and into the seat, a constant reassurance of power. It became a companion. This acoustic signature gave birth to one of the most enduring subcultures in trucking, the open pipe enthusiasts. It didn't take long for drivers to realise that the stock muffler, while efficient at silencing the engine to meet legal standards, was stifling the engine's true voice. In workshops across the Netherlands, Greece and Scandinavia, a new modification started to appear. Drivers would bypass the baffles in the muffler or install straight pipes with larger diameters. The result was a thunderous roar that could be heard miles away. When a straight-piped LB140 crested a hill and the driver engaged the exhaust brake, a mechanism that restricts exhaust flow to slow the truck down, it sounded like a belt-fed machine gun firing in slow motion. Duck, 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 duck. To the general public, it might have been noise pollution, but to the trucking community it was a mating call. It signalled that a king of the road was approaching. It allowed drivers to identify each other in the dark. You didn't need to see the grille, you heard the V8 coming and you flashed your high beams in salute. One of the more charming realities of this era involves the Scania cold start. We have to remember that fuel injection technology in the early 1970s was entirely mechanical. There were no computers to precisely meter the fuel based on ambient temperature. When you turned the key of an LB140 on a freezing morning in Lapland, a solenoid would click, opening the fuel rack to maximum. When the starter motor cranked that massive 14-litre block, the first few combustions were messy. The truck would erupt in a cloud of white and grey smoke, unburnt diesel atomizing in the cold cylinders. It would cough, stumble and shake the entire cab violently, like a wet dog drying itself. But then, as the cylinders warmed and the oil pressure climbed, the chaos would suddenly smooth out into that rhythmic steady idle. It was a daily ritual, a morning clearing of the throat that signalled the beast was awake. Let's touch on a technical reality that kept the drivers humble, the ride quality. While the engine was futuristic, the suspension was still stuck in the past. The LB140 sat on multi-leaf steel springs. Air suspension was a luxury dream for the future. The cab itself was mounted on rub blocks, which offered minimal damping. This meant that driving an empty V8 truck, bobtailing, was a kidney-bruising experience. Every expansion joint in the highway was transmitted directly to the driver's spine. The seats were mechanical, bouncing on simple springs. If you hit a pothole at speed, you would be launched towards the roof, only to come crashing down as the seat bottomed out. Drivers developed a specific posture, hovering slightly off the cushion when they saw bad road ahead, using their legs as shock absorbers. It's no wonder that back problems were the occupational hazard of the decade. However, the power of the V8 acted as a narcotic that made you forget the rough ride. There is a story about a driver named Elias, a logger in northern Sweden. Elias was a die-hard Volvo man, loyal to the brand from his hometown. He refused to drive the flat-faced Scania, calling it a shoebox. One winter, his truck broke down, and the only loaner available was an LB140 timber truck. Elias grumbled, climbed up into the high cab and set off into the forest to pick up a load of pine. The logging roads were steep, coated in packed snow and ice. Usually, with a full load, Elias would have to chain up his tyres and crawl up the gradients in first gear, sweating bullets. That day, he hit the first major incline with the Scania. He dropped a gear, waited for the engine to bog down, but it didn't. The torque curve held him. He could feel the V8 digging in, the deep rumble echoing off the trees. He crested the hill in a gear higher than he had ever managed before. When he got back to the depot, he didn't say a word. He just handed the keys back, walked to his boss's office, and asked when they could order one. The torque had converted him. It's important to note a key historical fact here regarding the layout. The shift to the cab-over engine design wasn't just a style choice. It was cemented by the European Council Directive 90/53/EC, though its predecessors in the 70s set the tone. Regulations strictly limited the total length of the truck and trailer combination, typically to 18 metres and later 16.5 metres for articulated lorries. Every inch you used for the hood was an inch you couldn't use for cargo. The Scania LB140 allowed hauliers to maximise the trailer length, fitting in 2 or 3 extra pallets of goods. In the low-margin game of logistics, that extra space was pure profit. The 140 series also introduced a level of dashboard ergonomics that, while primitive to us, was revolutionary then. The dashboard curved slightly around the driver. The gauges were large and clear, tachometer and speedometer front and centre, with smaller dials for air pressure, oil pressure, and water temperature flanking them. It was designed to be read at a glance. But let's be honest, the interior was still a sea of hard black plastic and vinyl. There was no walnut trim or plush carpet. It was a workspace, designed to be hosed out if necessary. The bunk behind the seats was often just a narrow foam mattress, barely wide enough for a grown man to turn over. Yet, to the drivers of the 70s, it was a suite at the Ritz compared to sleeping across the seats of a day cab. The success of the LB140 in these early years created a feedback loop. Drivers wanted to drive them because of the status and the power. Transport companies bought them to attract the best drivers. If you put a wanted ad in the paper saying driver needed new Scania V8, provided your phone would ring off the hook, it became a recruitment tool. As the decade wore on, the quirks of the engine became known. The early V8s had a thirst for oil that needed to be monitored. The water pumps were known to be a weak point if not serviced religiously. But these flaws were forgiven because of the performance, the sound, the height, the power. It all coalesced into a feeling of invincibility. You were no longer just a truck driver, you were a pilot of the asphalt, and as the miles piled up on those cast-iron blocks, the reputation of the Scania V8 transformed from a risky new experiment into the benchmark by which all other heavy trucks were measured. The struggle to adapt to the cab-over was over. The drivers had learned to swing wide on the turns, they had learned to trust the tilt cab, and most importantly, they had fallen in love with the song of the V8. But the engineers back in Södertälje weren't resting on their laurels. They knew that the competition was catching up, and that the 14-litre engine had even more potential locked inside its cylinders. The 140 was the pioneer, but the next evolution was about to refine that raw power into something even more durable. By the mid-1970s, the initial roar of the V8 revolution had settled into a steady industrious hum. The LB140 had proven the concept, but the world around it was changing rapidly. The carefree days of cheap fuel had come to a screeching halt with the 1973 oil crisis. Suddenly, the price of diesel wasn't just a line item on a spreadsheet, it was the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The trucking industry woke up with a collective hangover, realizing that raw power without efficiency was a luxury they could no longer afford. Into this new, cost-conscious reality, Scania rolled out the successor to the throne, the 141 series. Launched in 1976, to the untrained eye, it looked almost identical to the 140. It kept the same boxy, flat-fronted bulldog cab that had become a familiar silhouette on the Autobahn. But as any seasoned mechanic will tell you, never judge a machine by its sheet metal. The 141 was a masterclass in refinement. The engineers at Södertälje had spent the early 70s obsessing over a concept that would become the hallmark of Scania driving: low-rev philosophy. In the past, if you wanted a truck to pull hard, you had to spin the engine fast. High RPMs meant high horsepower, but it also meant high fuel consumption, high noise, and high wear. The pistons were travelling up and down the cylinders at a frantic pace, effectively trying to saw the engine block in half from the inside. With the 141 and its updated DS14 engine, Scania flipped the script. They tweaked the turbocharger, redesigned the pistons, and recalibrated the fuel injection pump to move the power band lower. The result was an engine that produced its maximum torque, a crushing 1,480 Nm at significantly lower engine speeds. This birthed the era of the green zone. On the Scania tachometer, the optimal driving range was marked in green. In the 141, this green band was wider and sat lower on the dial than in competitors' trucks. The goal was to keep the needle in the green. If you were revving into the unpainted area, you were just making noise and burning money. Driving a 141 required a new kind of discipline. Old-school drivers, used to screaming two-stroke Detroit diesels or high-revving Fiats, had to be retrained. They had to learn to shift up early. It felt counterintuitive to grab the next gear when the engine sounded like it was barely awake. But when you did, the V8 would just grunt, the turbo would whistle a low, mournful note, and the truck would surge forward with the inevitability of a glacier. This low-rev characteristic became legendary during one of the most romantic and dangerous chapters in trucking history, the Middle East Run. In the mid-70s, the oil-rich nations of the Middle East were booming. They were building cities, airports and refineries in the sand, but their ports were hopelessly clogged. Ships would wait for weeks to unload at Jeddah or Bandar Abbas. The solution? Truck it overland from Europe. This route, stretching from the rainy depots of London or Hamburg all the way to Tehran, Baghdad or Doha, was the ultimate endurance test. It was 3,000 to 4,000 miles one way, crossing the Iron Curtain, the Balkans, the mountains of Turkey, and the deserts of Syria and Iran. It was a journey that broke weak trucks and weak men. The Scania 141 became the undisputed king of this route. Why? Because of the cooling system and the torque. Picture the Tahir Pass in eastern Turkey. It's a grueling climb reaching over 8,000 feet in elevation. In the winter, it's a sheet of ice with sheer drops and no guardrails. In the summer, it's a dust-choked oven where temperatures can hit 45 degrees Celsius, 113 Fahrenheit. The sides of the road were often littered with the hulks of trucks that had boiled over, blown gaskets, or simply given up the ghost. There is a story of a British owner-operator named Geordie Dave. Dave was running a Scania 141 pulling a tilt trailer loaded with drilling equipment destined for an oil field in Iran. He hit the bottom of the Tahir Pass in July. The heat was shimmering off the asphalt so intensely it looked like the road was liquid. Ahead of him, a convoy of lesser trucks was pulled over, hoods up, drivers pouring water into radiators and praying to various gods. Dave didn't stop. He dropped the 141 into low range, put the needle in the bottom of the green zone, and just sat there. The big V8 fan roared into life, a viscous coupled fan that sounded like a small Cessna taking off when it engaged, but the temperature gauge stayed rock steady. He climbed past the overheated convoy, the engine thumping out that slow rhythmic beat, barely breaking a sweat. He later said the only thing that got hot in that truck was his coffee, thanks to the engine tunnel. The 141 introduced another technical detail that proved vital for these extreme hauls, the hub reduction rear axle. In a standard truck axle, all the gear reduction happens in the differential in the middle of the axle. This puts a massive amount of stress on the half shafts, the metal rods that spin the wheels. If you snap a half shaft in the middle of the Syrian desert, you are in serious trouble. Scania's hub reduction system moved the final gear reduction to the wheel hubs themselves. You can spot these axles easily. The centre of the wheel has a protruding planetary gear housing that looks like a soup can sticking out. By doing the final reduction at the wheel, the stress on the half shafts is significantly reduced. It also allowed for higher ground clearance since the central differential could be smaller. For drivers navigating the cratered, unpaved roads of the Middle East, this durability was the difference between getting home and getting stranded. Let's be honest though, the 141 wasn't a luxury lounge. While the mechanics were bulletproof, the interior was still very much a product of the 1970s. The colour palette usually involved shades of brown, vomit, green, or a depressing grey vinyl. The bunk was often just a padded shelf. There was no air conditioning as standard. Drivers on the Orient Run would often cut a hole in the floor and install a cool box, a rudimentary evaporative cooler, or just drive in their underwear with the windows down, eating dust for 3 weeks straight. Yet, the 141 earned a level of affection that bordered on the irrational. Drivers started naming their trucks. They painted murals on the sides. The custom trucking scene exploded during the 141 era. The large flat sides of the cab-over design became canvases for airbrushed Viking warriors, eagles, and desert sunsets. The Scania V8 badge on the grille was often gold-plated or illuminated with extra lights. This era also saw the refinement of the Scania Cyclone oil filter. It's a fascinating piece of engineering that Scania uses to this day. Instead of just relying on a paper filter to catch dirt, Scania employed a centrifugal cleaner. The engine oil is spun at high speed in a centrifuge. The heavy soot and metal particles are flung to the outside wall of the spinner by centrifugal force, forming a dense, rubbery cake of filth that you have to scrape out during a service. It sounds primitive, but it is incredibly effective. It removes particles far smaller than a paper filter can catch. This is one of the secrets to the V8's longevity. It's not uncommon to strip down a Scania engine with 1 million kilometers on it and find the cylinder liners looking almost brand new, simply because the oil was kept so clean. By the late 70s, the Scania 141 had firmly established the V8 as the premium choice. It wasn't just for heavy haulage anymore. General cargo fleets started buying them because the drivers were faster. A driver in a 141 could maintain a higher average speed without breaking the speed limit, simply because they didn't slow down as much on the hills. Time is money, and the V8 was a time machine. But as the decade drew to a close, the limitations of the LB cab were becoming apparent. It was a design from the 60s, and ergonomics were advancing. Drivers wanted more space. They wanted better sound insulation. They wanted a flat floor. The competition was launching newer, more modern cabs. Volvo had the F10 and F12, which were very comfortable. Scania knew they had the best engine in the world, but they needed a new wrapper for it. They were secretly working on a project that would revolutionize not just their trucks, but the entire concept of truck manufacturing. They were about to introduce the world to the GPRT range, a modular system that would mix and match components like a giant Lego set. The 141 had done its job. It had taken the raw, rowdy energy of the 140 and refined it into a reliable, world-conquering tool. It had survived the deserts of the Middle East and the frozen timber roads of Scandinavia. It had proven that a complex V8 could be as reliable as a hammer. As the calendar clicked, over into the 1980s, the decade of excess, synthesizers and big hair, the Scania V8 was about to get a new suit. The Series 2 was on the horizon, bringing with it intercooling and a whole new level of sophistication. But for many old-timers, the 141 remains the definitive real truck. A machine where you could fix anything with a wrench and a hammer, and where the driver, not the computer, was the final authority on how the engine ran. The calendar flipped to 1980, and the world traded disco balls for synthesizers, bell-bottoms for shoulder pads, and analog uncertainty for digital ambition. In Södertälje, Scania was preparing to unveil a project that was less of a new truck and more of a new philosophy. This was the dawn of the 2 Series, and with it the introduction of the GPRT range, a collection of letters that would revolutionize how heavy vehicles were built, bought, and driven. If the 1960s were about brute force and the 1970s were about survival, the 1980s were about intelligence. The challenge facing Scania was complex. How do you build trucks for 1,000 different jobs? From garbage collection in narrow Italian streets to timber hauling in the frozen Swedish north, without building 1,000 different factories? The answer lay in a concept that sounds suspiciously like a child's toy box: modularity. We often think of modularity as a dry corporate buzzword, the kind of thing that makes your eyes glaze over during a PowerPoint presentation. But in the hands of Scania's engineers, it was sheer genius. Imagine a box of Lego bricks. With the same standard set of bricks, you can build a castle, a spaceship, or a fire station. Scania applied this logic to 40-ton machines. They broke the truck down into standardized interfaces. The GPRT range was the physical manifestation of this. The G and P cabs were lower, designed for construction and local distribution. The R cab was the high-mounted, majestic tower for long-haul transport, the natural home of the V8. And the T cab stood for torpedo, the nose cab design for those who still preferred the classic bonneted look. What made this magical was that they all shared the same DNA. A door from a P cab could fit an R cab. The windshields were shared. The interior components, the dashboard clusters, the seats, the heating units were interchangeable across the range. This didn't just save Scania money, it saved the hauliers' sanity. It meant that a fleet mechanic in 1982 needed to stock fewer spare parts to service a mixed fleet of distribution trucks and long haulers. It was the industrial equivalent of finding out your phone charger works on your toaster and your lawnmower. For the V8 enthusiast, the star of this new show was the R142 and the T142. The 142 nomenclature followed the logic, 14-litre engine, 2 Series chassis. And while the modular cab was a breakthrough in comfort, finally offering a flattish floor and suspension that didn't treat the driver's spine like a pogo stick, the real headline news was hiding behind the grille. It was a single word, often written in a distinct italicized script, that became the tramp stamp of 1980s trucking: intercooler. Let's get technical for a moment, because intercooling is one of those terms people nod at without really knowing what it does. We know the V8 was turbocharged. A turbo compresses air to force it into the engine, but when used to compress air, a basic law of physics kicks in. It gets hot. Very hot. Hot air expands and becomes less dense, meaning it contains less oxygen per cubic centimetre. It's the same reason you feel lethargic on a humid, sweltering day. Engines feel the same way. The turbo was shoving air in, but because it was hot air, the combustion wasn't as efficient as it could be. Scania introduced the air-to-air charge cooler, or intercooler. It was essentially a radiator for the air. The hot air left the turbo, passed through this heat exchanger mounted in front of the radiator, got cooled down by the rushing wind, and then entered the engine. Cool air is dense. It's packed with oxygen. And when you mix dense, oxygen-rich air with a precise mist of diesel, you get a bigger bang. The result? The power jumped. The torque curve fattened up. The engine ran cooler and lasted longer. The Scania 142 intercooler pushed the output to somewhere in the region of 388 to 420 horsepower, depending on the spec, but it felt like more. It was the difference between a heavyweight boxer punching you with a gloved hand versus a bare fist. There is a wonderful human element to the intercooler badge. It became the ultimate status symbol on the European truck stop circuit. A driver named Klaus, who ran a refrigerated meat route from Hamburg to Milan in the early 80s, recalled the hierarchy. If you pulled into a truck stop in a 126-cylinder model and you parked in the back. If you pulled in with a 142 V8, you parked in the front. But if you had the intercooler badge, the waitress poured your coffee before you even sat down. The 2 Series also saw the refinement of the T-cab, the T142. While the rest of Europe was going crazy for the flat-fronted cab-overs because of length restrictions, there was a stubborn, romantic segment of the market that refused to give up the long nose. Construction companies, heavy haulage operators, and styling enthusiasts loved the T-cab. There is something undeniably primal about looking out over a long hood. It feels safer, it feels American in a way, but with Swedish build quality. The T142 V8 became the darling of the show truck scene. In the 1980s, customizing trucks went from a few extra lights to a full-blown art form. The T-cab offered more real estate for paint. We saw murals of Vikings battling dragons, airbrushed desert landscapes, and complex pinstriping jobs that cost more than a family car. Inside the cabin, the 2 Series was a revelation in ergonomics. Scania worked with doctors and ergonomists to design the driver's environment. They introduced the adjustable steering wheel, a feature we take for granted now, but back then, being able to tilt and telescope the wheel was like being given the keys to a spaceship. The dashboard curved around the driver, the cockpit style that put every switch within arm's reach. Let's be honest though, the 80s interior aesthetics were distinct. There was a lot of brown, a lot of beige. The fabric on the seats often had patterns that looked like the carpet in a bowling alley. But to a driver who had spent the 70s bouncing around in a metal tin, the 2 Series was a luxury suite. It was quieter, the insulation was thicker, you could actually listen to the radio, probably playing Phil Collins or ABBA, without turning the volume knob to 11. A key historical fact from this era involves the production line itself. The modular system allowed Scania to assemble trucks based on customer orders rather than building for inventory. This was the beginning of the Scania production system, heavily influenced by Toyota's lean manufacturing, but adapted for the low-volume, high-complexity world of heavy trucks. It meant that if you wanted a V8 with a specific axle ratio, a specific gearbox, and a pink cab, Scania could build it on the main line right next to a standard white distribution truck. One of the unsung heroes of the 142 era was the durability of the chassis. The roads in Europe were getting better, but Scania was exporting these trucks globally to places like South America and Australia, where road was often a theoretical concept. The 2 Series frame rails were made of high tensile steel that could twist and flex without cracking. There is an anecdote about an Australian road train operator named Bluey, who ran a Scania 142 across the outback. He was pulling 3 trailers, a gross weight of over 100 tons. He hit a kangaroo, a roo the size of a linebacker at speed. The bull bar took the hit, but the truck kept rolling. Bluey swore by the V8 not just for the speed, but for the grunt. He said, "In the 142, you don't shift gears for the hills, you shift gears for the horizon." The V8 sound in the 142 was slightly more muted than the raw 141 due to the turbo and intercooler plumbing chopping up the sound waves and the better cab insulation. But the open pipe boys weren't discouraged. They just used bigger pipes. The 80 saw the rise of the side pipe, exhausts exiting just behind the front wheel, blasting that V8 symphony directly at the concrete barriers, echoing back into the cab. It was an era of auditory indulgence. The gearbox in the 142 was also refined. The GR871 was a 10-speed splitter box that was robust and relatively smooth. But the real trick was the crawler gears. For heavy starts, you had 2 extra low gears that could get a locomotive moving. Using them required a specific technique, a slap of the stick and a deft release of the clutch, that separated the rookies from the veterans. As the 80s progressed, the Scania V8 became more than a tool. It became a brand within a brand. You didn't just drive a Scania, you drove a V8. The King of the Road slogan started to appear on marketing materials, not as a boast, but as a statement of fact. The competition was fierce, of course. Volvo had the F12 Globetrotter, which offered a cab so tall you could stand up in it, a feature Scania wouldn't fully match until later. Mercedes was building tank-like V8s and V10s, but the Scania had the torque, the look, and that modular magic that kept the cost of ownership reasonable. The 2 Series proved that you could have it all, the emotion of the V8 engine and the rational logic of a modular construction system. It satisfied the heart of the driver and the wallet of the fleet owner. It was the truck that solidified Scania's position not just as a niche manufacturer of premium trucks, but as a global powerhouse. But technology moves fast. As the neon-soaked decade of the 80s began to fade, aerodynamics started to become the new frontier. The boxy shape of the 2 Series, while efficient to build, was pushing a lot of air. Fuel prices were volatile. The environmental movement was waking up. The V8 needed to get slippery. It needed to get streamlined. The next chapter was waiting in the wind tunnel, ready to shape the most iconic silhouette in trucking history. As the neon haze of the 1980s began to drift into the rearview mirror, the trucking industry found itself standing at a crossroads. The pursuit of raw power had been the defining characteristic of the previous 2 decades, but a new, invisible adversary was asserting its dominance: the wind. Fuel prices had stabilized, but they had settled at a higher plateau, and the margins for haulage companies were tightening. Pushing a flat-faced, brick-shaped object through the atmosphere at 85 km per hour was an expensive battle against physics. The air resistance, or drag, increased exponentially with speed. Scania realized that to keep the V8 relevant, they didn't just need to make it stronger, they needed to make it slippery. Enter the 3 Series, launched initially in 1987 and culminating in the masterpiece that arrived in 1991, the Scania Streamline. For many purists, the 3 Series, particularly the R143 Streamline, represents the absolute zenith of truck design. It is the Goldilocks truck, modern enough to be comfortable and reliable, but mechanical enough to be fixed with a wrench and a hammer. It sits in that sweet spot of history where the computer had entered the cab but hadn't yet taken over the soul of the machine. The visual transformation was subtle but profound. Scania took the modular, boxy logic of the 2 Series and sent it to the wind tunnel. The result was the Streamline cab. It was a factory-designed aerodynamic package that integrated a roof deflector, side air collars, and a revised front bumper with softer, rounded corners. It might not sound revolutionary today, where every truck looks like a melted lozenge, but in 1991, this was cutting-edge industrial art. The Streamline reduced air drag by a staggering 12 to 15% compared to a standard R cab. In the world of logistics, where fuel is the single biggest operating cost, a 15% improvement was like finding a pot of gold at the end of every rainbow. But the Streamline wasn't just about efficiency, it was about style. The way the roof spoiler swept back from the top of the windshield gave the truck a crouching, aggressive stance, like a sprinter in the blocks. It looked fast even when it was parked. The signature colour for the launch was a pale, metallic blue, a hue that is still referred to by enthusiasts simply as Streamline blue. Underneath this slippery new skin, the V8 engine was undergoing its own digital revolution. This era marked the introduction of EDC, or electronic diesel control. Before this moment, the connection between the driver's right foot and the engine was entirely physical. You pressed the pedal, a cable pulled a lever on the injection pump, and more fuel went in. It was simple, but it was imprecise. With EDC, a computer began to mediate that conversation. Sensors monitored boost pressure, temperature, and engine speed, calculating the exact microdose of fuel needed for perfect combustion. This technology allowed Scania to push the 14-litre block to a new legendary figure, 500 horsepower. The 500 badge on the grille became the new benchmark. It was a nice, round, intimidating number. A Scania R143 500 wasn't just a truck, it was a continent crosser. It could pick up a load of paper rolls in northern Sweden on a Monday and deliver them to a printing press in southern Spain by Thursday, without breaking a sweat. Let's be honest though, the early days of electronics brought their own localized weather patterns of frustration. Drivers who were used to fixing problems with a screwdriver looked at the new black boxes with deep suspicion. If an EDC sensor failed, the truck might go into limp mode, crawling along at a snail's pace to protect the engine. It was a humbling experience for a king of the road to be limping home because a $10 sensor had a bad day. But when it worked, which was most of the time, the drive was sublime. The interior of the 3 Series is widely considered one of the best driver environments ever created. Scania perfected the wraparound dashboard. The entire console curved aggressively toward the driver, placing every switch, knob, and gauge within an easy sweep of the hand. You didn't have to lean forward to adjust the heater or check the diff locks. You just sat back in your air-suspended seat, held the wheel, and conducted the orchestra. The gear stick in the 3 Series deserves a mention of its own. Scania was still using a manual transmission for the heavy work, the GRSys 900. It was a 14-speed box, 12 main gears plus 2 crawlers, that required a split-shifting technique. The lever had a collar you lifted for high range and a switch on the side for the splitter. There was a specific tactile joy in operating this gearbox. The throw was long but precise. When idling, the long gear lever in a V8 would wobble rhythmically, dancing to the beat of the engine. Drivers called it the V8 shuffle. To shift gears smoothly, you didn't force it, you guided it. A perfect downshift, blipping the throttle to match the revs, resulting in a seamless engagement without a single shudder, was a source of immense professional pride. The 143 era also solidified the Scania V8 status in the custom truck scene, particularly in Greece. For reasons that are partly geographic and partly cultural, Greek owner drivers fell deeply in love with the 143. The mountainous terrain of Greece required high horsepower, and the proud, independent nature of the drivers resonated with the Scania brand. Greek trucks became famous for their extreme modifications. We aren't talking about a few extra lights. We're talking about chassis painted in bright reds and whites, interiors reupholstered in buttoned leather like a Chesterfield sofa, and exhaust systems that were more like church organs. They would tune the 14-litre engines far beyond the factory specs, sometimes pushing them to 800 or 900 horsepower for the sheer thrill of it. A Greek Talbot, or Vebis, pulling a refrigerated trailer of feta cheese up a mountain pass at night, glowing with 1,000 LEDs and roaring like a dragon, is one of the great spectacles of European transport. One distinct memory from this period involves the Centurion edition. In 1991, Scania celebrated its 100th anniversary. To mark the occasion, they released a limited run of Centurion trucks. These were high-spec 143s with special decals, upgraded interiors, and a numbered plaque on the dash. There's a story of a Scottish driver named Hamish who managed to convince his boss to buy a Centurion. Hamish was a timber hauler in the Highlands, a job that is notoriously hard on equipment. Mud, gravel, rain, and heavy pine logs usually destroy a truck in 5 years. Hamish treated that Centurion like a Rolls-Royce. He kept a pair of slippers in the cab and refused to drive with his work boots on. He would spend his Sunday mornings polishing the rims and waxing the paintwork, even though he knew it would be covered in mud by Monday lunch. One day, deep in a forest track, Hamish encountered a tourist whose car had slid into a ditch. The tourist, seeing the immaculate, massive truck approaching, expected a gruff, dirty workman. Instead, Hamish hopped out in his socks — he hadn't had time to put his boots on — hooked up a tow chain with surgical precision, and gently pulled the car free using the idle torque of the V8. The tourist offered him money. Hamish just pointed to the Centurion badge and said, "She doesn't do it for the money, she does it for the applause." The 3 Series also introduced a level of durability that is frankly startling. It is not uncommon today, 30 years later, to see a Scania 143 still working for a living in parts of Africa, South America, or the Middle East. The chassis was over-engineered, the electrics were simple enough to be rewired, and the mechanical parts were made of stern stuff. A technical detail that aided this longevity was the introduction of the saver ring in the cylinder liners. This was a small ring at the top of the cylinder bore that scraped carbon deposits off the piston crown, preventing bore polishing, a condition where the cylinder walls become too smooth and oil fails to stick, leading to engine seizure. It was a tiny piece of metal that added hundreds of thousands of kilometers to the engine's life. As the 90s progressed, the 143 Streamline became an icon. It appeared on t-shirts, mugs, and posters in teenagers' bedrooms. It transcended being just a tool of the trade. It was the king. The V8 rumble, smoothed out slightly by the turbos but still distinct, was the soundtrack of the highway. However, the relentless march of progress continued. The Euro 2 emission standards were looming. The 14-litre engine, a design that traced its roots back to the 1960s, was reaching the end of its development potential. It was a heavy block, and to get more power while meeting stricter pollution laws, Scania knew they would eventually have to redesign the heart of the beast. But before the 14-litre bowed out, it enjoyed a glorious Indian summer. The Streamline 143 remains the high water mark for the analogue truck. It was the machine that proved you could be aerodynamic without looking like a jelly bean. It proved that a truck could be a home, a workspace, and a piece of art all at once. Driving a 143 today is a sensory time capsule. You turn the key, and there is no computerized chime, just the heavy clunk of the solenoid. The engine catches with a familiar smoky bark. The gear stick shakes in your hand. The steering is heavy but communicative. You feel the road, you hear the turbo spool, and you understand why, for many drivers, the story of the Scania V8 peaked right here, in the blue-tinted shadow of the Streamline. By the mid-1990s, the Scania 14-litre engine had transcended the realm of mere machinery. It had become an elder statesman of the asphalt, a cast-iron patriarch that had seen the industry evolve from the rough-and-tumble days of the 60s to the regulated, logistical precision of the 90s. But as with all great dynasties, a changing of the guard was inevitable. The transition from the beloved 3 Series to the 4 Series marked the final chapter for the original 14-litre displacement, but it also sparked an explosion of enthusiast culture that turned truck ownership into a form of religious devotion. The shift happened around 1995 and 1996. Scania unveiled the 4 Series, a truck that visually broke every rule the company had established. They hired the famous Italian design house Bertone, the same people who penned Lamborghinis and Alfa Romeos, to sculpt the new cab. The result was shocking. Where the 3 Series was square, upright, and defiant, the 4 Series was rounded, organic, and curvy. It had a smiling grille and teardrop-shaped headlights. The traditionalists were horrified. They looked at this new aerodynamic shape and muttered that it looked like a bar of soap that had been left in the shower too long. They called it the anteater, or the jelly bean, but beneath the controversial Italian curves beat the heart of a Swedish Viking. The early models of the 4 Series, designated the R144, still carried the legendary 14-litre V8. It had been tweaked and tuned with advanced electronics to produce up to 530 horsepower, the absolute peak of what that original engine architecture could safely handle. This specific moment in time, the twilight of the 14-litre engine wrapped in the modern skin of the 4 Series, served as a catalyst for a massive cultural shift. Drivers realised that the classic V8 was living on borrowed time, environmental regulations were tightening their grip, and rumours were swirling that Scania was developing a new, larger engine to meet Euro 3 standards. This scarcity mindset turned the V8 into a collector's item while it was still in production. It was during this era that the phenomenon of truck styling went mainstream, particularly in the Netherlands, Scandinavia and the UK. We aren't talking about slapping a few stickers on the bumper. We're talking about a level of customization that borders on obsession. Let's look at the Holland style or Dutch style, which really found its footing in the late 90s. This aesthetic is all about smoothness and nostalgia. A Dutch-style Scania V8 is instantly recognisable. The exterior is usually debadged or painted in a clean two-tone scheme with a classic Vabis steering wheel visible through the windshield. They install a light box, a large illuminated sign above the windshield displaying the company name in a retro font. But the real magic happens inside. Drivers began stripping out the factory interiors and replacing them with acres of Danish plush. A high-pile, crushed velvet fabric that looks like it was stolen from a 1970s nightclub VIP section. They covered everything: the dashboard, the door panels, the ceiling, and the bunk. There is a technical, or perhaps ergonomic detail here that is fascinating. The 4 Series introduced a completely modular interior where the dashboard could be specified in different lengths. But the enthusiasts didn't care about the plastic. They cared about the atmosphere. They installed ambient lighting, red or blue LEDs tucked into the upholstery, to create a lounge-like vibe. A standard modification involved the bus floor. The factory floor of a truck usually has a hump for the engine tunnel. Enthusiasts would build a false floor to make it perfectly flat, cover it in wood or leather, and then institute a strict no-shoes policy. Let's be honest, trying to enforce a no-shoes rule when you're hauling gravel out of a muddy quarry in November is a logistical challenge that rivals the moon landing. You'll see burly drivers hopping on one foot on the running board, trying to unlace a boot without putting a sock in a puddle, all to protect their pristine beige carpet. This culture created a new calendar for the trucking world, the truck show season. Events like the Truckstar Festival in Assen, Netherlands, or Nordic Trophy in Sweden became pilgrimages. Imagine a fairground packed with 2,000 trucks. The air is thick with the smell of tyre shine and barbecue. But the dominant sensation is sound. This is where the open pipe culture we touched on earlier became organised. At a certain time of night, usually after the judges have put away their clipboards, a signal goes out. Hundreds of V8 engines fire up simultaneously. The sound of hundreds of 14-litre and early 16-litre engines revving in unison is not just noise, it is a physical event. It registers on seismographs. The ground shakes. The decibel contest became legendary, with trucks competing to see who could produce the loudest roar. The Scania V8, with its unique firing order, always won on quality, if not always on sheer volume. It had a depth, a bass frequency that hit you in the chest. One of the great characters of this scene was a Belgian owner-operator known as Polished Pete. Pete bought one of the last 14-litre 144s in 1999. He hauled shipping containers, a gritty, dirty job. But Pete's truck was a rolling mirror. He had polished the fuel tanks, the wheels, the toolboxes, and even the chassis rails. He spent every Sunday, rain or shine, under the truck with a rag and a bottle of metal polish. Pete had a theory. He said, "If the truck looks like $1 million, the client treats you like a partner, not a servant. And the forklift driver loads you carefully because he's afraid to scratch it." There was truth in it. When Pete rolled into a depot, the yard boss would come out just to look. The V8 wasn't just an engine for him, it was a business card. The 4 Series also introduced a significant technical upgrade that changed the driving experience: the OptiCruise transmission. This was an automated manual gearbox. It still had a clutch pedal, used only for starting and stopping, but the computer handled the gear changes while the truck was moving. At first, the real men hated it. They claimed a computer couldn't see a hill coming, but Scania's engineers had been clever. They programmed the Opticruise to work with the V8's torque curve. It wouldn't hunt for gears frantically. It would hold a gear and let the engine lug, just like a veteran driver would. It smoothed out the drive, saving fuel and saving the driver's left knee from the thousands of clutch depressions required in a traffic jam. The 14-litre finale was a bittersweet time. The engine, the DSC-14, was a masterpiece of reliability. By the late 90s, it was bulletproof. Mechanics joked that the only way to kill a 14-litre Scania was to drain the oil, fill it with sand and drive it off a cliff. And even then, it would probably still idle. But the writing was on the wall. The Euro 3 emission standards required higher injection pressures and more precise combustion control than the old block could easily accommodate. The architecture, dating back to Bengt Gadefelt's original drawings in the 60s, was tapped out. This looming extinction drove the prices of used 143s and early 144s through the roof. A pre-electronic or mechanical pump V8 became the holy grail for enthusiasts who wanted to tune their engines without needing a laptop. There was a thriving black market for older injection pumps. People were retro-modding newer trucks, putting older, simpler fuel systems on them to get that sharper throttle response and that black smoke, which, while environmentally frowned upon, was visually celebrated by the diehards. The community aspect of the V8 ownership is perhaps its most enduring legacy from this period. If you drove a V8, you waved at other V8s. It was a rule. You didn't wave at a 6-cylinder Scania, well, maybe a polite nod, and you certainly didn't wave at a Volvo unless it was to point out they were in the slow lane. There is a touching story about a convoy in the UK for a young boy who was terminally ill and loved trucks. His favourite was the Scania V8. The local trucking forum put out a call. On a rainy Saturday morning, over 50 V8 Scanias descended on this small suburban street. They lined up, polished chrome gleaming in the grey light. They took the boy for a ride in the lead truck, a fully customised 144 top line with a mural of a lion on the side. As they paraded through the town, the drivers played the V8 Symphony, revving their engines in a rolling thunder. The boy's father later said that for those 2 hours his son wasn't a sick kid. He was the king of the road. It showed that underneath the tough diesel-stained exterior of the trucking world, there was a heart as big as the engines they worshipped. The 14-litre engine had done its duty. It had built the brand. It had hauled the marble for the palaces of the Middle East, the timber for the houses of Scandinavia, and the food for the tables of Europe. It had inspired a cult following that treated a commercial vehicle with the reverence usually reserved for vintage Ferraris. But progress is a hungry beast. The demand for power was not slowing down. The 530 horsepower of the final 14-litre was impressive, but competitors were sniffing around the 600 mark. Volvo was plotting, MAN was engineering. To stay on the throne, Scania needed to do something radical again. They needed to break the mould they had cast in 1969. They needed more displacement. The 14-litre era was ending, not with a whimper, but with the roar of 1,000 open pipes at a truck show in Assen. The stage was cleared, the lights were dimmed, and in the engineering labs of Södertälje, a new monster was breathing for the first time. The 16-litre era was about to begin. As the world held its breath on New Year's Eve 1999, waiting for the digital apocalypse of the Y2K bug to shut down power grids and turn toasters into sentient overlords, the engineers at Scania were remarkably calm. They weren't worried about old computers crashing. They were too busy putting the finishing touches on a new mechanical giant. They knew that when the sun rose on the new millennium, the transport industry wouldn't need software patches, it would need horsepower. The year 2000 marked a seismic shift in the lineage of the king of the road. For 31 years, the 14-litre displacement had been the holy scripture of Södertälje. It was the number painted on the side of the legends. But physics is a cruel mistress, and she had decreed that the 14-litre block had given all it could give. To squeeze more power out of it while satisfying the draconian new Euro 3 emission standards would have required stressing the metal beyond its safety margins. So Scania did what they do best. They went back to the drawing board and decided that bigger was, in fact, better. They introduced the DC-16. This was not just a bored-out version of the old engine, it was a completely clean-sheet design. although it strictly adhered to the modular philosophy Scania had perfected. The displacement jumped from 14.2 litres to a massive 15.6 litres, though everyone rounded up to 16 for the sake of a catchy badge. The launch of the Scania R164 was the trucking equivalent of a heavyweight champion stepping back into the ring after a hiatus, looking bigger and meaner than before. The headline figure was 580 horsepower. In today's world of 700 plus horsepower monsters, 580 might sound modest, but in 2000 it was earth-shaking. It was the most powerful standard production truck in Europe. It reclaimed the crown that had been slipping toward competitors like Volvo and MAN. The secret to this new engine's performance, and its ability to pass the strict Euro 3 smoke tests, lay in a piece of technology called the unit injector, or pump a deuce. In previous generations, a central fuel pump sat on the side of the engine and sent fuel through long metal lines to each cylinder. It worked, but it was limited in how much pressure it could generate. The new DC engine did away with that. Instead, each cylinder had its own miniature pump and injector combined into a single unit, sitting right on top of the cylinder head. Here is the technical brilliance of it. These injectors were driven directly by the camshaft. A dedicated lobe on the cam would whack the injector plunger, generating immense pressure, up to 1500 bar right at the moment of injection. This ultra-high pressure atomized the diesel fuel into a microscopic mist that burned instantly and cleanly. It meant you could have massive power and clean exhaust. It was like switching from a garden hose to a water jet cutter. Let's be honest though, explaining the intricacies of fuel atomization at a dinner party is a guaranteed way to ensure you never get invited back. But for the drivers, the result was visceral. The throttle response on the R164 was immediate. There was no lag. You put your foot down and the truck simply surged. We have to talk about the physical changes to the truck to accommodate this beast. The V8 had always been compact, but the 16-litre version required more cooling. Scania had to lift the cab slightly higher on the chassis to fit a larger radiator and intercooler stack. This had a delightful side effect for the driver. The floor got flatter. The engine tunnel, which had been a knee-banging nuisance in the older models, shrank significantly. The cab felt airier, more like an apartment and less like a cockpit. A driver named Bruno, a heavy haulage specialist based in the Italian Alps, recalls the transition vividly. Bruno spent his days hauling marble blocks, massive dense cubes of stone that weighed as much as a small house, down from the quarries of Carrara. For years he had driven a 143-500. He loved it, but the climb back up to the quarry with an empty trailer was a slow grind, and the descent with a full load was a white-knuckle test of the exhaust brake. His boss bought the first R164 580 in the region. Bruno remembers the first time he took it up the switchbacks. It was like the trailer had fallen off, he said. The torque was so immense, 2,700 Newton meters, that he found himself skipping gears on a 12% gradient. But the real revelation was the retarder. The 16-litre engine was paired with an upgraded hydraulic retarder. This is a device in the transmission that uses oil resistance to slow the truck down without touching the wheel brakes. With the massive compression of the 16-litre engine and the retarder working together, Bruno could descend the mountain with 40 tons of marble on his back without his brake lights ever flickering on. He said the silence of the descent, controlled purely by the engine and the hydraulics, was almost spiritual. The R164 also introduced a visual tweak that enthusiasts spotted immediately. The grille was slightly different to feed more air to the hungry engine, and the bumper had a more aggressive chin. But the badge was the key. The V8 emblem was now prominently displayed, often accompanied by the horsepower rating and chrome numbers that were large enough to be read from space. However, the introduction of the 16-litre engine wasn't without its controversies among the purists. The sound had changed. The old 14-litre had a sharp metallic bark, a rat-a-tat-tat that sounded mechanical and raw. The new 16-litre, with its high-pressure injection and refined combustion, was smoother. It was a deeper, mellower thrum. Some of the open-pipe boys complained that it sounded too civilized. They said it sounded like a luxury yacht rather than a workhorse. But they soon discovered that if you removed the muffler and replaced it with a 6-inch straight pipe, the 16-litre didn't. Just bark! It bellowed. The increased displacement meant that each exhaust pulse was moving more air. The resulting sound was a sub-bass frequency that could rattle windows in villages 3 kilometers away. The 164 era also saw the Scania V8 solidify its position as the preferred tool for the owner-driver. In Europe, there is a distinct class of trucker who owns their own vehicle and contracts out to logistics firms. For these entrepreneurs, the truck is their office, their home, and their retirement fund. Buying an R164 V8 was a massive financial commitment. It cost significantly more than a standard 6-cylinder truck, enough to buy a small house in some parts of the country. But the logic held up. The V8 had higher residual value. You could run a Scania V8 for 5 years, rack up 700,000 kilometers, and still sell it for a premium price because there was always a line of buyers waiting for a second-hand king. It was during the early 2000s that the interior of the V8 really started to resemble a luxury car. The Platinum and King of the Road option packages added leather seats with the V8 logo embossed in the headrests. They added wood grain trim, which was actually plastic, but let's not ruin the illusion, and upgraded sound systems. The steering wheel became a chunky, leather-wrapped affair that felt substantial in the hand. One fascinating technical anecdote from this time involves the cooling system. The 16-litre engine produced a lot of heat. Scania engineers had to design a fan system that was intelligent. The cooling fan on the R164 was electronically controlled. It wouldn't just spin with the engine RPM, it would spin only as fast as needed. On a cold winter night in Sweden, the fan might barely turn, saving fuel and keeping the engine warm. But on a hot summer climb in Spain, it would lock up and roar like a jet turbine, sucking massive amounts of air through the radiator. Drivers learned to listen for the fan kick. When you heard that roar start, you knew the truck was working hard, and you knew the temperature needle would stay glued to the centre. The R164 580 was the flagship, but Scania also offered the V8 in slightly lower power ratings, like the 480. But let's be real, nobody bought the 480 because they wanted a 480. They bought it because their accountant wouldn't let them buy the 580. The 580 was the one everyone lusted after. It was the power of the millennium. As the years rolled on from 2000 to 2004, the R164 proved that the increase in displacement was the right move. The engine was relaxed, it wasn't stressed. A 16-litre engine producing 580 horsepower is like a bodybuilder lifting a bag of groceries. It's not breaking a sweat. This inherent lack of stress meant that million-kilometre engines became the norm, not the exception. There was, however, a looming shadow on the horizon. The regulatory bodies in Brussels were not sleeping. Euro 3 was just a stepping stone. Euro 4 and Euro 5 were coming, and they would declare war on nitrogen oxides, NOx. The simple days of just injecting fuel and air were ending. The era of exhaust after treatment, of chemical plants strapped to the chassis, was approaching. But for the first half of the 2000s, the Scania R164 stood tall. It had successfully bridged the gap between the mechanical past and the digital future. It proved that you could have a modern computer-controlled engine that still possessed the soul of a Viking. The V8 had survived the transition to the new millennium. It had grown bigger, stronger, and more sophisticated. The drivers had embraced the new sound and the new torque. But the engineers at Södertälje knew the battle was far from over. The competition was about to launch their own assaults on the horsepower record, and the environmental laws were about to get much, much tougher. The V8 would have to evolve again, and this time it would involve a battle over how the engine breathed and what came out of the tailpipe. As the calendar turned the page to 2004, the automotive world was fully entrenched in the digital age. The fear of the millennium bug had vanished, replaced by a new, far more tangible anxiety, the tightening noose of environmental legislation. In the grand halls of the European Commission in Brussels, bureaucrats were drafting the death warrants for dirty exhaust. They weren't interested in horsepower or torque curves. They were interested in parts per million. The Euro 4 and Euro 5 standards were looming on the horizon like a storm front. These regulations declared war on two specific byproducts of diesel combustion: nitrogen oxides, NOx, and particulate matter, PM, which is essentially soot. The problem for engineers was that these two enemies are on opposite sides of a chemical seesaw. To reduce soot, you need to burn the fuel at very high temperatures, but burning fuel at high temperatures creates massive amounts of NOx. Conversely, if you lower the temperature to kill the NOx, the engine chokes on soot. It was an engineering catch-22 that forced almost every truck manufacturer to scramble. Many competitors looked at their V8 and V10 engines, did the math on the research and development cost required to clean them up and simply gave up. They switched to inline-6 engines, which are easier to cool and manage, but at Södertälje, surrendering the V8 was never an option. It would be like the Rolling Stones firing Keith Richards. The band might play on, but the soul would be gone. Instead, Scania doubled down. They launched the R-Series, a truck that would become the canvas for one of the most intense engineering battles in the company's history. The R-Series, introduced in the spring of 2004, was a visual evolution rather than a revolution. The cab lines were sharpened, the grille became more assertive, and the interior was overhauled to offer a level of quality that rivaled premium German sedans. But the real story was the badge. The 164 nomenclature was retired. Now the trucks were named simply by their series and their horsepower. The V8 lineup consisted of the R500, the R560, and the new heavyweight champion, the R580. To keep these big engines legal without neutering their performance, Scania made a controversial bet. While the rest of the industry, Volvo, Mercedes, DAF, was rushing toward a technology called SCR, selective catalytic reduction, Scania decided to go it alone with EGR, exhaust gas recirculation. Let's break this down because it defines the driving experience of the mid-2000s. SCR requires a fluid called AdBlue, a solution of urea and water. You inject this pig pee, as the drivers affectionately called it, into the exhaust stream, where a chemical reaction turns the nasty NOx into harmless nitrogen and water. It's effective, but it requires the driver to fill a second tank. It adds weight. It adds complexity. Scania knew that truckers are creatures of habit who value simplicity. They didn't want to force their customers to handle a new fluid. So, they chose EGR. The technical principle of EGR sounds somewhat counterintuitive. You take some of the exhaust gas that has just left the engine, cool it down through a massive heat exchanger, and then shove it back into the engine's intake to be burned again. By diluting the fresh air with inert exhaust gas, you lower the combustion temperature, which prevents NOx from forming in the first place. It sounds elegant, but in practice, it is like asking an athlete to run a marathon while breathing through a straw that is recycling their own breath. It puts immense thermal stress on the engine. The cooling requirements are astronomical. Scania had to redesign the entire front cooling package of the R-Series to handle the heat rejection. The gamble paid off, at least initially. When the R-Series launched, Scania could proudly say, "No AdBlue needed." For fleets operating in remote areas where AdBlue infrastructure was non-existent, this was a massive selling point. A driver named Lars, who ran timber trucks deep in the forests of Finland, swore by his EGR V8. "I don't want to carry jugs of chemical water into the woods," he said. "I just want diesel and coffee." However, the horsepower wars were not paused for the sake of the environment. In 2006, Scania dropped a bombshell that proved the V8 wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. They introduced the R620. The number 620 was magic. It broke the 600 horsepower psychological barrier that had stood for years. But the torque was the real headline: 3,000 Newton meters. To achieve this while managing the EGR system, Scania utilised a new fuel injection technology called XPI, extra high pressure injection, developed in partnership with Cummins. This was a common rail system, meaning a high pressure reservoir of fuel was available to the injectors at all times, regardless of engine speed. The XPI system allowed for multiple injection events per combustion cycle. Instead of one big squirt of fuel, the injector could fire a tiny pilot spray to warm up the cylinder, followed by the main bang, and then a post-injection to clean up the soot. This digital precision allowed the R620 to run smoother and quieter than any V8 before it. The R620 became the ultimate status symbol of the late 2000s. It was the truck you bought if you wanted to overtake uphill. But it also required a new driving style. The engine was so smooth, and the cab insulation so thick, that drivers often didn't realise how fast they were going. The visceral vibration of the old 14-litre was gone, replaced by a deceptive turbine-like whoosh. There is a humorous reality check regarding the EGR system, however. As the trucks aged, the EGR valves, the gates that controlled the flow of exhaust gas, became notorious for clogging with soot. Mechanics developed a love-hate relationship with them. Cleaning a coked-up EGR valve was a dirty black job that left you looking like a 19th century chimney sweep. Drivers also noticed that the EGR engines ran hotter. The fan would kick in more often. On a long climb in the summer, the roar of the cooling fan became the dominant soundtrack, drowning out the engine itself. It was the sound of the truck fighting to keep its cool while eating its own exhaust. Despite these technical hurdles, the R-Series was a runaway success. It was voted International Truck of the Year in 2005. The jury praised the ergonomics, particularly the top-line cab. The top-line was the penthouse suite of trucking. Scania had moved the bunk to above the windscreen in previous models, but in the R-Series the layout was refined. The passenger seat could fold and rotate, creating a lounge area. The materials were upgraded again, soft-touch plastics, better leather and thicker curtains. For the long-haul driver, the R-Series V8 was a home. A German owner-operator named Dieter, who practically lived in his R580, modified his cab to include a microwave, a flat-screen TV, and a custom espresso machine bolted to the dashboard. He spent 280 nights a year in that truck. He famously said, "My apartment in Berlin is for my mail, my Scania is for my life." The R-Series also saw the introduction of the V8 styling pack as a factory option. Scania realised that the V8 was a brand in itself. They started offering chrome trim, V8 badges on the door handles, V8 symbols in the speedometer, and even a V8 logo that projected onto the ground when you opened the door, a feature that appeared in later generations but was prototyped in this era. They were leaning into the cult, but the emissions noose continued to tighten. Euro 5 arrived in 2009, demanding even lower limits. Scania managed to squeeze the V8 through the Euro 5 hoop using their beloved EGR technology, but it was becoming a strain. The engines were complex, filled with sensors and actuators. The keep it simple philosophy was being tested to its breaking point. Meanwhile, the competition had fully embraced SCR and AdBlue. They were achieving better fuel economy because their engines could breathe freely, letting the chemical after-treatment clean up the mess in the tailpipe. Scania eventually had to concede that for the highest power outputs and the strictest future standards, AdBlue would be necessary. It was a rare moment of the engineers at Södertälje having to swallow their pride along with the urea. This era also birthed a specific subgenre of the open pipe scene. Because the EGR system and the variable geometry turbos muffled the exhaust sound significantly, the desire to make the truck loud became even more desperate. The valve system became popular. This was a Y-pipe installed in the exhaust. One branch went through the factory muffler to keep the police and the vehicle inspectors happy. The other branch went straight out to a side pipe. A pneumatic valve, operated by a switch hidden in the dashboard, controlled the flow. You would see an R620 rolling quietly through a German village, a model of compliance. Then, once it hit the autobahn, the driver would flick the switch. Click. The valve would open, bypassing the muffler, and the V8 would roar to life, announcing its presence to everyone within a 5-mile radius. It was a cat-and-mouse game with the authorities that added a layer of illicit thrill to the ownership experience. The R-Series era also highlighted the V8's dominance in a very specific sector: livestock transport. Hauling live animals is a delicate job. You cannot have a jerky ride. The cattle or pigs will fall and get injured. You need power to maintain a constant speed up hills, so the animals aren't thrown around by constant gear changes. And you need reliability because you cannot break down with 200 sheep on board in the summer heat. The Scania V8 became the standard tool for the bull haulers of Europe. In Ireland and the UK, the livestock convoys are almost exclusively Scania V8s. There is a specific pride in this community. Their trucks are washed daily, despite the nature of their cargo. An Irish driver named Colm, who drove an R560 cattle truck, explained it simply: "The cargo is precious. The truck should reflect that. Plus, if I break down, the farmer loses money. With the V8, I don't break down." As the first decade of the 2000s came to a close, Scania had successfully navigated the minefield of Euro 4 and Euro 5. They had kept the V8 alive when others had abandoned it. They had broken the 600 horsepower barrier. They had created a truck in the R-Series that was comfortable, safe, and incredibly fast. But the engineers knew that the ultimate test was still ahead. The Euro 6 standard was being drafted, and it looked impossible. It required near zero emissions. It would require combining EGR, SCR, and a particulate filter. It would require a chemical plant underneath the chassis. Many industry analysts predicted that Euro 6 would finally kill the V8. They said there was no room for the plumbing. They said it would be too expensive. They said the V8 was a dinosaur that had survived the meteor of Euro 3 and 5, but the ice age of Euro 6 would surely finish it off. Scania remained silent on the matter, but behind the locked doors of the technical centre, they were already working on the response, and they weren't just planning to meet the standard, they were planning to shatter the horsepower record again. The 700 Club was calling, and Scania intended to be the first to kick the door down. The year 2010 arrived, and with it came the climax of the Great Horsepower War. If the previous decades had been a polite tennis match of engineering one-upmanship between the European manufacturers, this new era was a bare-knuckle boxing match. Volvo, Scania's neighbour and eternal rival from Gothenburg, had thrown a massive haymaker by launching the FH16 700. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, the king of the road was looking at the taillights of the competition. In the trucking world, being second is like being last. The pride of Södertälje was bruised. The engineers didn't just want to match the 700 figure, they wanted to crush it. They wanted to put a number on the door that would end the argument. In April 2010, Scania pulled the trigger. They unveiled the R730. The number alone, 730, sent shockwaves through the industry, 730 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a Ferrari Enzo, one of the most extreme supercars of the era, produced 660 horsepower. Scania was selling a work vehicle, designed to haul potatoes and timber, that had more muscle than Maranello's finest. But the horsepower was just the vanity metric for the brochures. The number that actually mattered, the number that made seasoned transport managers spill their coffee, was the torque, 3,500 Newton meters. This level of twisting force is hard to visualize. It is enough torque to uproot a medium-sized oak tree. It is enough to twist a standard steel drive shaft into a pretzel if the traction control doesn't intervene. When you put your foot down in an R730, you didn't just accelerate, you altered the rotation of the Earth slightly. To achieve this, Scania completely unshackled the 16.4-litre V8. They utilised the XPI, extra high pressure injection system, to its full potential. We touched on this technology with the R620, but in the R730, it was running at pressures that were bordering on sci-fi, up to 2,400 bar. The fuel was being forced into the cylinders with such violence that the atomization was nearly perfect, allowing for a ferocious burn that was somehow still clean enough to meet the EEV, Enhanced Environmentally Friendly Vehicle, standards. The driving experience of the R730 was described by journalists and lucky first customers as surreal. In a standard truck, when you hit a steep grade with a full load, the engine note changes, the revs drop, and you feel the weight of the cargo pulling you back. In the R730, the hill simply ceased to exist. There is a story of a Norwegian driver named Big Olaf who operated a road train hauling lumber in the mountains near Lillehammer. In Norway, they allow gross combination weights of up to 60 tons. Olaf had driven 500s and 580s his whole life. He was used to the crawl up the icy gradients. When he took delivery of his R730, he hooked up a full 60-ton load and hit his usual nemesis, a 10% grade that went on for 3 kilometers. He braced himself for the downshifts. He waited for the struggle. But the R730 just held 12th gear. The needle sat at 300 RPM, and the truck marched up the mountain at 80 kilometers per hour. Olaf later said he actually laughed out loud in the cab. It felt like cheating. It felt like the laws of physics had been suspended for his benefit. However, channeling 3,500 Ns of torque to the road presented a terrified victim: the gearbox. A standard transmission would have disintegrated under that kind of load. Scania had to heavily reinforce their Opticruise system. They introduced the GRSO 9.2 Diffbauer gearbox. The gears were shot-peened for extra hardness, the shafts were thicker, and the software was rewritten to be smarter. The computer knew exactly how much torque the drivetrain could handle in each gear. In the lower gears, it actually limited the engine's output to prevent the tyres from shredding or the half shafts from snapping. It only unleashed the full 3,500 Nellasnor once the truck was moving and in the higher gears. It was like having a minder on a cage fighter, only letting him loose when it was safe. The R730 also became the poster child for Scania's Black Amber Limited Edition. This was a styling exercise that proved trucks had become luxury goods. The paint was a deep metallic brown that looked black in the shade and glowed like whiskey in the sun. It featured chrome detailing, matte black rims, and an interior signed by the company's founder. These trucks weren't just bought by logistics companies. They were bought by owner-drivers who mortgaged their houses to get one. It was the ultimate flex. Rolling into a truck stop in a black amber R730 was like landing a private jet on the highway. Other drivers would walk over just to look at the badge to verify that the 730 was real. A crucial technical detail of the R730 era was the cooling package. Generating 730 horsepower creates an immense amount of waste heat. The V8 block is a dense piece of iron, and keeping it from melting required a radiator that looked like it belonged on a locomotive. Scania engineers had to widen the intake openings in the grille. If you look closely at an R730 compared to an R500 of the same year, you'll see the mesh is more open. They optimised the airflow through the engine bay, creating a wind tunnel effect that sucked heat out of the V. It was a triumph of thermodynamics, ensuring that even on a scorching day in Spain, hauling 40 tons, the temperature needle didn't flinch. The R730 also solidified the Scania V8's dominance in the heavy haulage sector. We are talking about the transport of abnormal loads, wind turbine blades, bridge sections, mining equipment. These loads can weigh 100, 150 or even 200 tons. For this work you don't care about fuel economy or top speed. You care about breakaway torque, the ability to get the wheels turning from a dead stop. The V8's low-down grunt made it the preferred prime mover for these leviathans. There is a legendary video that circulated on the forums. During this time, it showed a single Scania R730 pulling a transformer weighing 180 tons. The truck was engaged in a push-pull setup with another truck, but the lead Scania was doing the heavy lifting. You could see the chassis twist slightly as the driver applied the power. The engine note deepened into a guttural roar, smoke puffed from the stacks, a rare sight on a modern truck, and slowly, majestically, the massive load began to move. It was a demonstration of power that silenced the critics who called the 730 a show truck. But with great power came great responsibility, specifically fuel responsibility. The critics argued that a 16-litre, 730 horsepower engine would drink diesel like a sailor drinks rum. Scania countered with a concept called downspeeding. The theory was simple. Because the R730 had so much power, you could run a very tall rear axle ratio. This meant the engine could cruise at highway speeds at very low RPMs, sometimes as low as 1000 or 100 RPM. At these speeds, the big V8 was barely awake, sipping fuel rather than guzzling it. Real-world tests proved them right. On hilly routes, the R730 often achieved better fuel economy than smaller engines because it never had to downshift. While a 500 horsepower truck was screaming in 9th gear to get up a hill, the 730 was loping up in 11th or 12th. It proved that sometimes having too much power is exactly the right amount. The R730 era also saw the integration of the Scania driver support system. This was a digital coach in the dashboard that rated your driving in real time. It gave you stars for anticipation, braking, and gear selection. It was a clever psychological trick. Drivers, being naturally competitive, started trying to get a 100% score. They would coast up to junctions, use the retarder gently, and accelerate smoothly, all to please the little computer in the dash. It turned driving the most powerful truck in the world into a video game of efficiency. One humorous side effect of the R730's speed was the limiter frustration. In Europe, heavy trucks are electronically limited to 90 km/h, 56 km/h. The 730 could reach that speed in the blink of an eye and would happily sit there against the limiter up the steepest slopes. Drivers described the sensation of the limiter cutting in as hitting a cotton wool wall. The truck wanted to go 120 or 130 km/h easily, but the computer said no. It was a caged beast, prowling against the bars of the law. By 2012 and 2013, the R730 had settled into its role as the undisputed king. Volvo eventually responded with 750 horsepower, continuing the war, but for Scania fans, the 730 remained the sweet spot. It was the peak of the Streamline generation, which was reintroduced as a model name in 2013. The Streamline R730s were arguably the best-looking trucks Scania ever built. They had the aero kits, the V8 stance, and the power. They were the ultimate expression of the fossil fuel era before the shadow of Euro 6 fully descended. But even as the champagne corks were popping for the 730, The engineers were nervous. The Euro 6 deadline of 2014 was non-negotiable. The R730, for all its might, was a Euro 5 to ZEV machine. Making this monster clean enough to pass Euro 6, which required virtually zero NOx and particulates, was going to be the hardest engineering exam Scania had ever taken. They would have to strap a chemical factory to the chassis. They would have to combine EGR and SCR. They would have to manage heat in ways they never had before. The 730 would survive into the Euro 6 era, but the transition would require a new generation of thinking. And beyond the engine, the cab itself, the R-Series shell that had been around in various forms since the 4 Series, was getting old. It was time for a complete clean sheet design. A new generation was coming, a generation that would offer a flat floor, a digital cockpit, and a level of luxury that would make the R730 look like a vintage tractor. The next gen was on the drawing board, and it was going to change everything. The summer of 2016 brought a heatwave to Europe, but the temperature inside the Grand Palais in Paris was rising for a different reason. For 10 years, behind high fences and non-disclosure agreements, Scania had been burning through 20 billion Swedish krona, the largest investment in the company's history. They were building a new future. When the curtain finally fell in that Parisian hall, the world met the next generation. And for the disciples of the Griffin, the headline news wasn't just the sleek new lines or the advanced aerodynamics, it was a single letter, S. The S-Series was introduced as the new flagship, sitting proudly above the venerable R-Series. And it brought with it a feature that drivers had been dreaming about since the first cab over rolled off the line in the 60s, the flat floor. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to remember the doghouse. For 50 years, the engine tunnel, that hump covering the engine between the seats, had been an accepted intruder in the cab. It was a knee banger, a coffee spiller, and a tripping hazard. It dictated how you moved, how you dressed, and how you slept. With the S-Series, Scania finally banished the hump. By raising the cab floor slightly higher, they created a completely level surface from door to door. You could stand up in the S-Cab, all 2 meters and 7 centimeters of it, and walk from the driver's seat to the passenger seat without performing a gymnastics routine. For the long-haul driver, this was a transformation of their living conditions. It turned the truck from a cockpit into a studio apartment. A driver named Sven, who ran a refrigerated route from Oslo to southern Spain, described his first week in an S580 as moving out of a tent and into a hotel. He could cook his dinner standing up. He could stretch his back after a 10-hour shift. The psychological impact of that extra space, the feeling of airiness, reduced the mental fatigue of the job significantly. But the next gen wasn't just about space, it was about position. Scania's ergonomists had done something controversial. They moved the driver. In the previous generations, you sat quite far back and slightly inboard. In the S-Series, they moved the driver's seat 65mm closer to the windshield and 20mm toward the door. It sounds like a minor adjustment, but it changed the entire geometry of driving. You felt more connected to the road. The pillars were thinner, the dashboard was lower, and the visibility was suddenly panoramic. You weren't just operating the truck, you were wearing it. Beneath this luxurious penthouse, the V8 engine was still the beating heart, but it had to coexist with the strict reality of Euro 6. We mentioned the complexity of Euro 6 earlier, but by 2016, Scania had mastered it. They managed to package the entire after-treatment system, the diesel particulate filter, DPF, the selective catalytic reduction, SCR, and the ammonia slip, catalyst, into a single compact box on the side of the chassis. It was a silencer that was actually a chemical processing plant. To keep the V8 relevant in this clean air era, Scania engineers had to perform some thermal wizardry. The V8 engines in the next gen, initially available as 520, 580 and 730 horsepower, used a fixed geometry turbocharger on the lower power outputs for simplicity and robustness. They simplified the exhaust manifold to retain heat because the chemical system needs heat to work. If the exhaust is too cold, the AdBlue doesn't react and the emissions spike. So, ironically, the challenge switched from how do we cool this beast to how do we keep it warm enough when it's idling? They introduced a throttle valve in the exhaust that could partially close to build back pressure and heat up the engine rapidly on cold mornings. The driving experience of the next-gen V8 was further refined by a major update to the Opticruise transmission, the lay shaft brake. In previous automated gearboxes, when you shifted up, the computer had to wait for the engine revs to drop naturally before it could engage the next gear. This took a fraction of a second, a pause in the acceleration. The new gearbox had a small brake on the internal shaft that forced the gears to synchronize instantly. The result was shift times that were sliced in half. The 40-ton truck shifted gears with the snap and speed of a sports car. It kept the turbo spooled and the momentum rolling. Visually, the next-gen V8s were distinct. Scania didn't shout about the V8 connection, they whispered it. The grille had a specific mesh pattern with larger hexagonal holes to feed the radiator. There were subtle V8 badges on the side skirts and the mud flaps, and inside the premium perception was pushed even higher. The dashboard retained the classic Scania wraparound feel, but was updated with softer materials. The hard plastics of the 4 Series were gone, replaced by textured surfaces that wouldn't look out of place in a luxury sedan. The infotainment system finally caught up with the 21st century, offering Apple CarPlay and advanced navigation that knew the topography of the road ahead. There is a fascinating detail about the modular holes in the chassis. Scania introduced a new frame design where the entire length of the chassis rail was pre-drilled with a grid of mounting holes. This meant that bodybuilders, the people who bolt on cranes, timber bunks or cement mixers, didn't have to drill into the hardened steel themselves. They just bolted their equipment on. It saved hours of labour and ensured the rust protection of the frame remained intact. The aerodynamic efficiency of the S-Cab was also a quantum leap. Scania had spent thousands of hours in the wind tunnel. They sealed the gaps between the panels. They designed air curtains in the bumper that forced air around the wheels to reduce turbulence. Even the mirrors were sculpted to reduce wind noise. A British driver named Sarah, who switched from an R-Series to a new S650, commented on the silence. "In the old truck," she said, "you had to turn the radio up when you hit the motorway. In the S-Series, you can hear yourself breathe. You can hear the rain tapping on the glass. The V8 rumble is still there, but it's distant, like thunder in the next valley." This silence, combined with the flat floor, attracted a new generation of couples to the trucking life. Team driving became more comfortable. With the S-Cab, the passenger seat could swivel around to face the bed, creating a dining area. The bed itself could extend to a width of 100 centimeters. It allowed 2 people to live in the truck for weeks at a time without killing each other. However, the launch wasn't without a minor legal hiccup that became a piece of trucking trivia. Scania initially named the trucks S500, S580 and S730. A certain German car manufacturer, Mercedes-Benz, politely coughed and pointed out that they owned the trademark for S-Class, followed by numbers, like S500. To avoid a courtroom battle, Scania quietly flipped the badges. The S500 became the 500S. It was a small change, but it makes early production S-first models a rare collector's curiosity today. The reception of the next gen was overwhelming. It won the International Truck of the Year award in 2017. The jury praised the driver environment and the fuel economy. But for the V8 diehards, there was still a lingering question. The 730 horsepower engine was mighty, but it was essentially an older design tweaked for the new chassis. Rumours were swirling that Volvo was planning something big. The horsepower war wasn't over. The next-gen platform, with its robust cooling capability and stronger chassis, was built for more than just 730 horses. It was a cage built for a bigger monster. The engineers had created the perfect host. Now they just needed to finalise the ultimate parasite. As the decade drew to a close, the stage was set for the final, definitive statement in internal combustion. The S-Cab offered the luxury and the aerodynamics. The legislation was met. The flat floor provided the comfort. All that was missing was a number that would silence the competition once and for all. The 770 was coming. The year 2020 will go down in history as a time when the world stood still. Highways were eerily empty, factories fell silent and borders closed. But inside the Research and Development Centre at Södertälje, the lights never flickered. In the midst of global uncertainty, Scania was preparing to send a message that would reverberate through the asphalt of every continent. They were about to reclaim the crown, and they were going to do it with a number that sounded like a jetliner. In late September 2020, Scania unveiled the 770S. For nearly a decade, the rivalry with Volvo had been a sore point. Volvo's 750 horsepower engine had technically held the title of the world's most powerful factory production truck. Scania's R730 was a legend, yes, But in the playground of heavy haulage, numbers matter. The 770S didn't just inch past the competition, it kicked the door down and sat on the throne. The headline figure was 770 horsepower, but the number that actually terrified the transmission engineers was the torque, 3,700 Newton meters. To put that into perspective, that is roughly the same twisting force as 3.5 Porsche 911 turbos combined, all available at a remarkably low 170 RPM. But the real story of the 770S wasn't just more fuel, big bang. It was a complete rethinking of the V8 architecture to solve the reliability headaches of the previous decade. The most significant news for the mechanics and the owner-drivers was what was missing. For years, the V8s had relied on exhaust gas recirculation, EGR, to meet emission standards. As we discussed, EGR was effective but messy. It recycled soot, created heat, and added complex plumbing that was prone to failure. With the 770S and the updated V8 range, Scania finally cut the cord. They achieved the strict Euro 6 standards using only SCR, selective catalytic reduction. The twin dosing AdBlue system was the hero here. By injecting the urea solution at 2 different points in the exhaust stream, once right after the turbo and again in the muffler, they could kill the NOx without choking the engine with its own exhaust. The engine could finally breathe clean, fresh air again. For the drivers, this meant the end of clogged EGR valves and the return of a cooler-running, happier engine. To handle the immense cylinder pressures required to generate 770 horsepower without blowing the head off, Scania couldn't use standard cast iron. It was too brittle. Instead, they cast the block from compacted graphite iron, CGI. CGI is a metallurgical marvel. It has a molecular structure that resembles coral, strong, interconnected, and able to withstand immense fatigue. By using CGI, Scania could make the cylinder walls thinner but stronger. The result was an engine that was 75 kilograms lighter than its predecessor. Imagine taking a grown man off the front axle while adding 40 horsepower. That is the definition of engineering elegance. Then there was the turbocharger. In the 770S, Scania ditched the variable geometry turbo found in the lesser models. They went for a fixed geometry turbo, FGT, but with a twist. It ran on ball bearings. Ball bearing turbos are usually the domain of race cars. They have almost zero friction. When you touch the throttle in a 770S, the turbo spools instantly. There is no lag. There is no waiting for the boost to build. You ask for power, and the engine delivers it with the immediacy of an electric motor. This raw power presented a problem for the rest of the drivetrain. Scania had recently introduced a brilliant new gearbox called the G33CM for the standard trucks. It was light, fast, and efficient. But when the engineers hooked it up to the 770 prototype, the computer simulations likely showed it twisting into scrap metal. The 3700 N was simply too much, so the 770S had to stick with the older, battle-hardened Gaston 926 gearbox. It was heavier, yes, but it was bulletproof. It was the only transmission in the parts bin that could shake hands with the 770 without breaking its wrist. The driving experience of the 770S is hard to describe without sounding like a fantasy. A driver named Marco, who runs a specialised transport company in the Swiss Alps, took delivery of one of the first units. His job involved pulling low-loader trailers carrying heavy construction machinery, excavators, crushers and pavers, up the steep passes to ski resorts. Marco recounts pulling a 60-ton gross load up the Simplon Pass. In his old truck, this was a second-gear affair, engine screaming, speed dropping to 15 kilometers per hour. In the 770S, he set the cruise control to 40. The truck selected 8th gear. The revs dropped to 1 of 100, and it just sat there. It didn't hunt for gears. It didn't roar. It just hummed a deep, confident baritone and marched up the mountain as if gravity had taken the day off. He said it was the most relaxing climb of his life. The removal of the EGR system also brought back something the enthusiasts had been missing: the sound. While the 770S is incredibly quiet inside the cab thanks to the insulation, outside the exhaust note is sharper. The new exhaust manifolds, designed to separate the pulses for the turbo, created a distinct staccato beat. It's a blat 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 sound that signals high performance. Of course, owning a 770S is a statement of excess. Nobody needs 770 horsepower to deliver groceries. It is a flagship product, designed to be aspired to. It appears on the bedroom walls of teenagers and in the retirement plans of owner-drivers. But there is a logic to the madness. Scania marketing pushed the concept of total operating economy. The argument was that because the 770S has so much power, it spends 90% of its life coasting. It doesn't have to work hard. On rolling terrain, it maintains momentum where other trucks have to brake and accelerate. Real-world fuel tests showed that, surprisingly, the 770S could be more fuel efficient than a 500 horsepower truck on heavy routes. It was the tortoise and hare fable, rewritten. The hare was so fast it didn't even have to run. It just walked past the tortoise while sipping a latte. The 770S also featured the electrically assisted steering system. This allowed for features like lane keep assist, where the steering wheel gently nudges you back into your lane if you drift. For the old-school drivers, this was heresy. I don't want the truck to steer itself. But after a 10-hour shift in crosswinds, even the hardest veterans admitted it saved their shoulders. Visually, the 770S is subtle. Scania didn't paint it neon green. It usually comes in dignified metallics. The only giveaways are the chrome 770S badges on the grille and the red detailing on the cylinder heads if you tilt the cab. It is a wolf in a bespoke suit. By 2021, the 770s had cemented Scania's position at the top of the food chain. It proved that the internal combustion engine still had life in it. It proved that you could make a massive V8 that was clean enough to drive through the centre of London or Paris. But the 770S isn't just a highway cruiser, it's a workhorse. Its true home isn't the Autobahn, but the forests and the mines, where the roads are made of mud and the loads are measured in centuries of growth. While the Scania V8 is often celebrated as the polished jewel of the motorway, a machine seen gleaming under the lights of truck stops or cruising effortlessly in the fast lane, its true spiritual home is far removed from the smooth asphalt and the painted lines. To understand the raw utilitarian necessity of this engine, one must leave the highway. You have to turn off the main road, past the end of maintenance signs, and venture into the mud, the ice and the dust. This is the world of heavy haulage and the timber trade, where the V8 isn't a luxury. It is a survival tool. In the vast, silent forests of northern Sweden and Finland, trucking is a different sport entirely. Here, the gross combination weight limits are pushed to the absolute extremes of engineering. While the rest of Europe typically caps trucks at 40 or 44 tons, the Nordic countries operate under high-capacity transport, HCT regulations. In Finland, a standard timber truck can legally weigh 76 tons. In special trial schemes, they are running combinations that hit 92 tons or more. Imagine standing on a frozen logging road in the Arctic Circle. It is 3 a.m, pitch black, and 20 degrees below zero. The silence is absolute, heavy enough to weigh on your eardrums. Then, you hear it. The distant low-frequency throb of a V8 echoing off the pine trees. A timber truck, an R770, or perhaps a well-worn R620 emerges from the gloom. It is not just pulling a trailer, it is pulling a mountain of pine logs. The truck itself is a 6x4 or 8x4 rigid, meaning it has multiple drive axles to find grip on the packed snow. Behind it is a dolly and a trailer, creating a snake of machinery that is 25 metres long. For the drivers in this sector, the V8's torque curve is the difference between getting home and freezing to death. When a 76-ton truck is stopped on an icy incline deep in the forest, getting it moving again is an exercise in physics that borders on art. You cannot simply dump the clutch and floor it. The wheels will just polish the ice, and you will slide backward into a ditch. You need breakaway torque at idle. This is where the Scania V8 shines. A driver named Mika, a third-generation logger from Karelia, describes the technique. He engages the differential locks, putting power to all the drive wheels. He selects the lowest crawler gear, C1. He gently lifts the clutch without touching the throttle. The massive 16-litre engine, churning out thousands of Newton-meters at just 600 RPM, rotates the wheels with a slow, relentless force. The tyres bite. The chassis groans as the slack is taken up. And slowly, miraculously, the load moves. An inline-6 engine, with its smaller displacement, would often stall or require higher revs that break traction. The V8 simply walks the load out of the woods. This environment also demands a specific technical feature, the load transfer system. Scania timber trucks are equipped with a button that allows the driver to dump the air from the tag axle, the rearmost non-driven axle, or lift it entirely if empty. By doing this, they transfer more weight onto the drive axle, crushing the tyres down into the snow to find grip. It's a dynamic balancing act performed from the driver's seat. But the timber trade is just one theatre of war. The other is heavy haulage, the movement of abnormal loads. If you have ever been stuck in traffic behind a police escort and a truck carrying a wind turbine blade, a massive transformer, or a house, you have witnessed the V8 in its element. Heavy haulage is not about speed, it is about control. These loads can weigh 150, 200, or even 250 tons. Scania builds specific tractors for this work, often designated as heavy haulage specials. These are usually 8x4 configurations, 4 axles, 2 driven, with a tower behind the cab. This tower houses extra fuel tanks, air tanks, and crucial hydraulic cooling systems. The key technical differentiator here is the torque converter. While standard trucks use a friction clutch, the heavier Scania V8 haulers use a hydraulic torque converter. This device uses fluid to transfer power from the engine to the gearbox. It allows the truck to sit stationary with the engine revving, building up immense torque multiplication before the wheels even turn. It allows for a launch so smooth that you wouldn't spill a cup of coffee on the dashboard, even while pulling a 200-ton generator. There is a legendary story from the construction of a wind farm in the Scottish Highlands. The access road was a gravel track with a 14% gradient and a hairpin turn. A competitor's truck, a highly capable 6-cylinder machine, tried to pull the nacelle, the heavy generator box of the turbine, up the hill. It overheated halfway up and had to be towed down backward, a dangerous and humiliating operation. The transport company called in a subcontractor with a Scania R730 8S4. The driver, a woman named Fiona who was famous in the UK heavy haulage scene, hooked up to the trailer. She engaged the crawler gears. She watched her temperatures. The V8 roared. The cooling fans in the tower behind the cab screaming like jet engines to dissipate the heat from the hydraulics. She crawled up that 14% grade at walking pace, the truck never faltering, never surging. The linear power delivery of the V8 meant there were no sudden jerks that could destabilise the load. She delivered the nacelle to the summit, unhooked, and drove back down for a cup of tea while the other crew was still letting their engine cool down. The crawler gears in the Scania Opticruise gearbox deserve a specific mention here. Standard trucks have 12 gears. Heavy haulers have 12 plus 2 crawlers. These gears are incredibly short. In C1, the top speed of the truck might be 3 km per hour at maximum revs. It provides the leverage of a pry bar. It allows the driver to manoeuvre a 50-metre long beam through a village roundabout with millimetre precision, moving the truck inches at a time without burning out the clutch. We must also look to the other side of the world, to the Australian outback, to see the V8 in its most gladiatorial arena. Australia allows road trains, trucks pulling 3 or 4 trailers, stretching over 50 metres in length. These centipedes thunder across the desert on single-lane tarmac strips, battling heat, dust and kangaroos. The gross combination mass can exceed 130 tonnes. The enemy here is not ice but heat. Ambient temperatures can hit 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit. The asphalt radiates heat up into the engine bay. A standard European truck would boil over in an hour. Scania test their V8s extensively in the Australian interior for this very reason. The cooling packages are upgraded with tropical specs. The air intake filters are massive cyclonic units designed to spin the red dust out of the air before it reaches the engine. If that dust gets into the cylinders, it acts like grinding paste, destroying the engine in minutes. An Australian driver named Dingo runs a quadruple road train from Darwin to Adelaide. He drives an R770. He swears by the V8 not for the speed but for the legs. He explains that on the long, flat stretches, he can set the cruise control and the big engine just lopes along at 1100 RPM. Is not stressed. A stressed engine is a dead engine out here, he says, and if you break down 300 clicks from the nearest town, you're in big trouble. The V8's reliability is a safety feature. The Australian market also loves the bonneted T-cab, and although Scania stopped making the T-cab officially in 2005, a Dutch company called Vlastuin Truckerbouw still converts modern Scania S-cabs into T-cabs, torpedoes, under license. These custom, next-gen torpedoes, with 770 horsepower engines, are the ultimate status symbol for the Australian cattle haulers. They offer the safety of the long nose, crumple zone for animal strikes, with the modern technology of the S-series. Back in Europe, the V8's dominance in heavy haulage has created a unique aesthetic. These trucks are often the show ponies of the fleet, because they work hard but don't rack up high mileage like the international logistics trucks. A heavy haulage truck might only do 50,000 kilometres a year, but every one of those kilometres is a battle. Because they last so long, owners invest heavily in them. You will see 8S4 Scanias with custom lockers, diamond plate catwalks, and intricate light bars. The heavy tower behind the cab is often painted with murals. They are the dreadnoughts of the road, massive, imposing, and incredibly powerful. There is a human element to operating these machines that is often overlooked: the anxiety. Moving a wide load is stressful. You're taking up 2 lanes. You have oncoming traffic panicking. You have bridges that are only 2 inches higher than your load. The driver is constantly calculating, watching mirrors, listening to the radio instructions from the escort pilots. In this high-stress environment, the truck needs to be invisible. The driver doesn't want to worry about being in the wrong gear or the engine stalling. They want the machine to be an extension of their will. The Scania V8 provides that confidence. It provides a surplus of power that acts as a buffer against the unexpected. If you need to accelerate to clear a junction quickly, the power is there. If you need to hold a load on a hill, the torque is there. One final technical note on the V8 in these extreme scenarios is the exhaust brake performance. The sheer displacement of the 16-litre engine means that when the exhaust brake is engaged, it provides massive retarding power. The engine acts as a giant air compressor, resisting the rotation of the wheels. For a timber truck descending a slippery, muddy track where touching the wheel brakes might cause a lockup and a jackknife, the engine brake is the primary way of controlling speed. It allows the driver to walk the truck down the mountain safely. The heavy haulage and timber sectors are where the King of the Road title is actually earned. On the highway, the V8 is a luxury, a way to save time and look good. But here, in the mud and the mines, it is a piece of industrial equipment without peer. It is the difference between a job done and a call to the recovery tow truck. As the sun sets over a logging site in Dalarna and the driver straps down the final chain on a load of spruce, the V8 idles. The sound is different here than on the highway. It's softer, absorbed by the snow and the trees. It's the heartbeat of the forest industry. The driver climbs up into the warm cab, kicks the snow off his boots, and releases the parking brake. The lights cut through the darkness, the crawler gear engages, and the legend goes to work. As we navigate the final miles of this chronicle, we find ourselves driving into a horizon that looks vastly different from the smoky, industrial dawn of 1969. The world has changed. The highways are smarter, the logistics are digitized, and the air is cleaner. The roar of the internal combustion engine, once the undisputed anthem of progress, is slowly being hushed by the quiet hum of electric motors and the promise of hydrogen fuel cells. And yet, in this brave new world of batteries and gigabytes, the Scania V8 refuses to go gently into that good night. It stands today as the last of the Mohicans, the sole surviving V8 truck engine in European production. It is a poignant reality. One by one, the other titans of the industry retired their big V engines. Mercedes-Benz said goodbye to the V8 and V10. MAN dropped their V10. Iveco moved on. They all reasoned that the inline-six was sufficient, that it was efficient, that it was the rational choice. But Scania, driven by that unique culture in Södertälje and the fervent passion of its customer base, held the line. They understood that for a certain breed of driver, rational is a word for accountants, not for kings. However, the survival of the V8 in the 2020s and beyond isn't just about nostalgia, it is about adaptation. The engine that once bellowed black smoke on the steep grades of the Alps has become an unexpected champion of sustainability. This brings us to a crucial technical detail of the modern era: hydrotreated vegetable oil, or HVO. HVO is a synthetic diesel made from waste fats, residues, and vegetable oils. Unlike the biodiesel of the early 2000s, which could clog filters and rot rubber seals, HVO is chemically identical to premium fossil diesel. You can pour it into a 1969 LB140 or a 2024 770S, and the engine won't know the difference, but the atmosphere will. Running a Scania V8 on pure HVO 100 reduces net carbon dioxide emissions by up to 90%. This is the lifeline that keeps the heartbeat strong. It allows a haulier to run a massive 16-litre 770 horsepower beast, while boasting green credentials that rival electric vehicles in the total lifecycle analysis. There is a fleet owner in the Netherlands named Bram who runs a fleet of green V8s. His trucks are painted in a verdant metallic green. On the back doors it reads, "Powered by waste, driven by passion." He tells his clients, "I can deliver your flowers with zero guilt, but I refuse to do it with zero soul." But we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, or perhaps the electric eel in the room. Scania is aggressively developing battery electric trucks. The e-trucks are here. They are silent, they have immense torque, and they are the future for regional distribution. But for the long haul, for the heavy timber in the Arctic, and for the heavy haulage across continents, the V8 remains the master. There is a fascinating internal rivalry at Scania right now. In 2021, they launched the Super Powertrain, a new 13-litre inline-six engine that is a marvel of thermal efficiency. It is, on paper, the most efficient diesel engine the world has ever seen. It rivals the V8 in many performance metrics, but sales figures tell a story of human emotion. When given the choice between the sensible, ultra-efficient Super and the legendary V8, thousands of drivers still tick the box for the extra cylinders. They are buying the V8s now with a sense of urgency, treating them like future heirlooms. This sentiment is best captured by a young driver named Elias, based in northern Sweden. Elias is 24 years old. He grew up sitting on the engine tunnel of his father's 143. When he started his own company in 2023, he took out a massive loan to buy a 660 SS V8. When asked why he didn't buy a cheaper, more efficient six-cylinder or wait for an electric truck, he touched the dashboard and said, "Because one day they will stop making this sound, and when I am an old man, I want to be able to tell my grandchildren that I drove the king. I want to be the guy who turns the key on a Sunday morning in 2050 and wakes up the neighbourhood." The legacy of the Scania V8 is also being preserved in the digital realm. In truck simulation games, which have exploded in popularity, the Scania V8 is consistently the most downloaded and driven truck. A teenager in Tokyo or a gamer in Sao Paulo who may never even see a real Scania in person knows exactly what a straight pipe 164 sounds like. They know the shift pattern of the Gyros 100. The culture has transcended the physical machinery and become a global digital appreciation society. Geographically, let's take our final drive to a place that symbolises this enduring legacy, the E4 highway heading north towards Haparanda and the Finnish border. This road is the spiritual spine of Sweden. As you drive north, the traffic thins. The pine trees grow taller and denser. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the asphalt. It is here, on these long, lonely stretches, that the V8 makes the most sense. You see them approaching from miles away. The distinctive V-shaped daytime running lights of the next gen, or the retro yellow spotlights of a restored 3 Series. They pass you with a rush of air and that deep rhythmic thrum. Wub 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 wub. It is a sound of commerce, yes, but also a sound of connection. It connects the remote timber camps to the sawmills, the iron mines to the ports, and the past to the present. The future of the V8 is finite, of course. Scania has committed to science-based climate targets. The combustion engine will eventually be phased out. There will come a day, perhaps in 2035, perhaps 2040, when the last V8 block is cast in the foundry at Södertälje. It will be a day of mourning for the industry. That final engine will likely be placed in a museum, silent and pristine, a monument to the era of oil and iron. But until that day comes, the V8 is not dying. It is taking a victory lap. The engineers are still tweaking it. The software is getting smarter. The friction is being reduced. The 770S might not be the final number. Rumours of an 800 horsepower swan song persist in the dark corners of internet forums, a final thank you to the faithful. The story of the Scania V8 is, at its core, a story about the refusal to compromise. In 1969, they didn't compromise on power when the hills were too steep. In the 80s, they didn't compromise on comfort when the roads were rough. In the 2000s, they didn't compromise on the V8 layout when the emissions laws tried to kill it. And today, they don't compromise on the emotion of driving. It is a machine that became a friend. For the driver alone in the cab on Christmas Eve, parked in a lay-by in Germany, while the rest of the world eats dinner, the V8 is a companion. The warmth from the engine tunnel, even if the floor is flat now, the heat is there, is a comfort. The badge on the steering wheel is a reminder that they are part of a tribe, a brotherhood and sisterhood of the Griffin. As we look back at the lineage, from the 350 horsepower LB140 that shocked the world, through the legendary 143 Streamline, the Million Mile 4 Series, the EGR Battling R Series, to the tectonic plate-shifting 770S. We see more than just steel and aluminum. We see the history of modern Europe. We see the goods that built our homes and filled our fridges. We see the evolution of the driver from a manual labourer to a highly skilled logistics pilot. The Scania V8 proves that a tool can have a soul. It proves that engineering can be art. And it proves that even in an industry driven by spreadsheets and margins, there is always room for a little bit of thunder. So the next time you're on the highway and you see that Griffin badge and you hear that low, confident rumble, give them a wave. You're looking at royalty. You're looking at the king of the road, taking his final glorious drive into the history books. And so, we pull into the final rest stop of our journey. The parking brake engages with a soft, familiar hiss. Psht! The big diesel heart, which has been beating steadily for so many miles, slows its rhythm. You turn the key, and the vibration beneath you ceases, replaced by the gentle ticking of cooling metal. Tick, tick, tick. It's the sound of a job well done, of a giant resting after a long haul. Look out through the windshield one last time. The highway's quiet now, just a ribbon of grey stretching out into the velvet darkness. The lights of the distant towns twinkle like fallen stars, steady and calm. The cabin is warm, a safe cocoon against the night. The dashboard lights fade to black, leaving you in the comforting embrace of the shadows. You can feel the heaviness in your eyes now, a pleasant weight pulling them closed. The road is behind you, the cargo is delivered, the miles are logged. There is nothing left to do but sink back into the seat, let your breathing slow down to match the idle of a sleeping engine, and drift away. The hum of the tyres is gone, replaced by the silence of the night. The world is still. The V8 sleeps, and so should you. Sweet dreams.